Good morning, everybody. My name is Holger Klein, and I'm currently serving as the director of the Sakıp Sabancı Center of Turkish Studies here at Columbia University. And it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to today's online workshop on autocratic legalism, the use of legality in authoritarian consolidation. And given the strange and unprecedented circumstances we are all finding ourselves here in these days, I must say that I'm absolutely delighted to be here this morning and to welcome such a distinguished group of participants in what is the first for us at the Sakıp Sabancı Center. Well, we have never before held an online workshop of this kind. I'm thrilled that our colleague and friend, Professor Ayşe Kadıoğlu, was undeterred by the obstacles put in her way and has fearlessly embraced this new format, while many of our other planned events for this semester unfortunately had to be cancelled or postponed to a later date in the coming academic year. So before I introduce Professor Kadıoğlu properly as the organizer and mastermind behind this workshop, allow me to give you a brief background to this event. 2 years ago, when the Sakıp Sabancı Center started its scholarly activities and programming here on the Columbia campus, we asked our first Sakıp Sabancı visiting scholar, Emre Hatipoğlu, then a faculty member at Sabancı University, whether he would be interested to organize an academic workshop as part of our annual program to mark his presence here at Columbia and to share his expertise with colleagues from within and outside our scholarly community. And Emre was, as he usually is, delighted to do so, and he organized a workshop on social media in an age of polarized politics for us in late March 2018. And when Ayşe Kadıoğlu arrived in September 2019 as our second visiting scholar, she too immediately ran with the idea to organize a workshop on a timely topic within her area of academic interest and expertise. So as the organizers of this event, we at the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies are most grateful for Ayşe's enthusiasm and could not be happier to have her with us here this academic year. But before I properly introduce her and turn the podium over to the specialists, I would like to extend my sincere thanks on behalf of Columbia University to the members of the Sabancı family who have made the Sakıp Sabancı Center and its programming a reality. I also would like to acknowledge and thank the Istanbul Policy Center at the Sabancı University and the Stiftung Mercator Initiative for being our co-sponsor for today's event. Last but not least, of course, I would like to thank the staff of the Sakıp Sabancı Center, namely François Carrel-Billard and Sharon Kim, for their tireless work behind the scenes to make today's workshop a success. And those of you who have been in touch with François and with Sharon know that there has been a lot of legwork going into the travel arrangements at first, or to set up the workshop, and then we went to an online format, and I have to say without Sharon and François we couldn't do it. So thank you on that end. And thank you, Ayşe, for running with the idea to do this as an online workshop, because I think this is a novelty, but I think opportunities like these are also ways for us to explore things that we haven't done in the past. And it is a learning curve for us to use different formats to reach wide audiences beyond Columbia University and New York. So with this said, I want to give at least a brief introduction to Ayşe Kadıoğlu, who has been a professor of political science at Sabancı University since 1998 and served her institution as both the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and Social Sciences from 2013 to 17, and as acting president from October 16 through January 18. Before joining Columbia University as a visiting scholar at the Sakıp Sabancı Center this academic year, she was a visiting scholar at Harvard's Minda de Günzburg Center for European Studies and a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School. Professor Kadıoğlu holds a PhD in political science from Boston University and MA in international relations from the University of Chicago. And before that, she did her undergraduate work in political science at Middle East Technical University. Ayşe has been a regular participant of the Yale Law School's ongoing annual Middle East Legal Studies seminar since 2004. She's one of the advisors for the online network Free Speech Debate that is based at the University of Oxford. And she served as member of the Board of Trustees of the Sakıp Sabancı Museum in Istanbul, as a member of the executive board of the Education Reform Initiative at Sabancı, and in many, many other capacities. So, as I said, we could not be happier to have you as a colleague here at Columbia this year. And given the circumstances that we are all social distancing at this point, we are glad that we can see you and that you are inviting your colleagues in the field to host this workshop and to broadcast this workshop across the bounds of Columbia campus. So without further ado, I will turn the podium over to Ayşe and her colleagues, and thank you all for participating. I hope this will be a very fruitful workshop, despite the fact that we can't see each other in person. Well, we can see each other in person, but we cannot physically be with each other. And I hope very much that we will have an opportunity to physically engage at some point in the future in talks, in a workshop that continues the discussion that we are starting today. So thank you very much for participating. And Ayşe, thank you for this wonderful opportunity that you're giving us. Thank you.
Thank you, Holger. It's really great to be together. Now that we're doing this online, in fact, I can see my colleagues from all around the world. So it has become wider. So that's, that's the good part, I guess, the advantage of doing it like this. Before I go ahead, I would like to turn to my dear colleague in Istanbul, Senem Aydın Düzgit. She's representing Istanbul Policy Center today. Fuat Keyman had to be in another Zoom meeting, but he will join us later. Senem is my dear colleague at Sabancı University. She's a professor of political science. She's one of the foremost experts on studying European Union in Turkey and in the world. She has several, books and many, many articles on the issue. And Senem is currently directing the research and academic affairs at the Istanbul Policy Center. Istanbul Policy Center is one of our, it is our actually only co-sponsor. We are doing this workshop, by the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies at Columbia University, and it's co-sponsored by Istanbul Policy Center, in Istanbul. It's part of Sabancı University. So I turn the floor to Senem. Okay, you're mute.
Okay, yeah, all right. Thank you very much, Ayşe Hocam, and thanks very much for hosting this workshop. And we're very happy to be co-sponsoring the event. Let me just say just a few words about the Istanbul Policy Center, what we are, what we do, especially in terms of the topics of the workshop today, the kind of issues and the projects that we cover. IPC it's an institution, it's like a think tank that have been established at Sabancı University since 2001. So it's in fact a part of the university, but it also functions like a think tank, creating policy relevant output, policy relevant publications and projects. And since 2012, we've had a partnership, ongoing partnership with the Mercator Stiftung Foundation in Germany. And we call this the Mercator IPC initiative, where basically what we do is that we conduct research on certain topics of primary importance to governance in Turkey and Europe today, such as Turkey-Germany relations, Turkey's relations with Europe, climate change, domestic governance, local governments, governance of migration, in particular concerning the issue of Syrian migrants now in Turkey. And to do these, what we do is that we host IPC Mercator Fellows, which basically are scholars, younger, more junior scholars, some of them postdocs from all over Europe. We host them at IPC. They are selected through a competitive process in which they conduct their research on any of these issues. And we also host IPC Mercator senior fellows as well. Again, you know, some of the fellows that we've had in the past from both the US and also Europe, again, working on these issues and spending a couple of weeks at the IPC. Now, basically, our work touches upon issues relating to democracy and human rights and rule of law, both in the context of the IPC Mercator initiative, but we also have other initiatives that are independent of that, but that also deal with the issue of democracy, more particularly in the Turkish case. Now, of course, we know about the current situation with democracy, the backsliding and the deterioration of the rule of law and all that. And keeping that in mind, we had established, again, back in 2012, something called the Checks and Balances Network. Now, in the Checks and Balances Network, what we have is that this is a network of around 295 NGOs that come together under the larger umbrella of IPC, where we are the actual coordinators of the network. And all of these NGOs, they basically meet in different configurations of around 7 configurations that each deal with a certain branch of the government, executive, legislative, judiciary, NGOs, media, etc. So the extra governmental terrain as well, where they trying to do basically what is currently not very much present in the Turkish context, that is attaining checks and balances, or using civil society and civil society networks at both the local and the national level to raise at least a certain awareness regarding checks and balances in Turkey. And this has been quite a successful initiative, so much so that the Swedish Development Agency decided to fund this network as of 2018. So for the last 2 years, there has been a major funding by SIDA to that effect. So basically what we do is that these reform groups are working on monitoring the government, trying to deal with capacity building or enhance capacity building, again at the level of NGOs and civil society. And so they've been doing quite a good job so far, of course, given the political constraints that do exist at the moment. Now, of course, in addition to that, there are also other issues and policy areas which we deal with that again touch upon these issues of rule of law and democracy. For instance, we do a lot of work on the European Union, and of course our IPC Mercator initiative has also relations with Europe as one of the priority areas. Where, of course, I mean, in the specific case of Turkey, the real issue is all about the Copenhagen political criteria and how Turkey does not sufficiently fulfill that criteria for a while now. So we've been doing quite a lot of work on the backsliding issue, on what's been happening and what needs to be done. So that has also been part of our agenda. And in addition to this, in the last year or so, we've added an extra cluster to our activities in terms of urbanization and local government, because what we've been seeing in the Turkish context, and I think this is something that we've been seeing in other national contexts in Europe as well, is a rise or a focus at the local level. And in most instances where we have centralized administrations that deteriorate in terms of rule of law standards, we have local governments, you know, speaking up in opposition or advocating a more inclusive, less polarized agenda. So there is this increasing focus on the local. We don't think that this is unique to Turkey. We see it in other cases as well, in some of the cases in Central and Eastern Europe, for instance, that we see that. But in the Turkish case, especially after the last local elections, this has also become a very prevalent issue, which is why we're giving an extra focus on the local dimension of governance and how the local is now, in fact, changing in terms of the content, in terms of the expectations of the citizens that are increasingly dissatisfied with the erosion of democracy and rule of law, etc., by the central administration. And very finally, and I'm going to finish it at that, Ayşe Hocam, we have a cluster on conflict resolution. And here, of course, we're not just referring to international conflicts, we're referring to domestic conflicts as well. So we've done a lot of work regarding the Kurdish issue, for instance, in the specific case of Turkey. And we have Ayşe, who's a professor at Sabancı University, who's mainly running the conflict program at Sabancı. Okay, I think I'm going to stop it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senem. And thank you to Istanbul Policy Center for co-sponsoring our event. I'm not mute, right? Right now. Okay.
No, you're not.
This is, I mean, this is indeed a time of unparalleled anxiety that we are in. And I just read an interview by David Castor. He's known as the author of Grief at Harvard Business Review. And he says that the discomfort that we're currently feeling is called grief. We can, feel the world has changed. We think it is temporary, but we are not really so sure if it is temporary. It probably isn't. And just as going to the airport became forever different from how it was before September 11, things will change. We feel the loss of normalcy, the fear of economic toll, loss of connection. We are grieving collectively right now. And as scholars who study the dismantling of democracies at a global level, we are also becoming increasingly aware of a suffocating military discourse, the language of we are at war, as well as government measures that are curtailing basic freedoms. Prime Minister Hungary Viktor Orban's, recent grab of power, akin to a coup, says it all. We can feel the rise of what we can call enabling acts at a global level. Moreover, I must admit, I also feel the loss of an attribute that has always been key to my existence, as a scholar of political science. And that attribute is called human agency. It seems like with the pandemic, we are surrounded by things we cannot control, really, which eventually diminish our sense of agency. And I must admit, I do not like that feeling at all, and I'm making a great effort to regain that sense of making history, rather than watch it take its toll on us. A recent declaration by Women's International League for Peace and Freedom responding to the pandemic was titled, "We Are Not Soldiers." And it was really a breath of fresh air. They underlined that most people are staying at home not because they think this is a war and they must obey a superior command, but because they know that this protects the groups most at risk, by preventing the spread of the virus. In the face of a warlike framework, they propose a framework of care and solidarity. I'm quite excited today to welcome you all under these circumstances, and quite excited that Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies at Columbia University is undertaking this pioneer online workshop, an act in the spirit of Sakıp Sabancı, a much revered pioneer himself, and someone who empowered and supported pioneers in many fields, including the academy, especially the social sciences. Thank you for your enthusiasm and cooperation in our effort to resurrect human agency rather than submitting into silence. I will now leave the floor to the moderator of our first session, Tim Frye of Columbia University. It's a great honor to see you here, Professor Frye. So the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. I wanted, first of all, to thank all the organizers for putting together what really looks like a terrific program under less than ideal circumstances. And to kick things off, we have two of the most authoritative voices on autocratic legalism and the erosion of democracy. And I think these are really inspired choices to lead a panel on what is autocratic legalism, in the sense that no two people in the world, I think, are more identified with these with this term than our two presenters today. Both scholars combine really deep immersion in their areas of social science expertise, but they also bring deep knowledge of particular cases of democratic backsliding. I think that's really important because when we think about autocratic legalism, it is often the legalistic details that allows autocrats to expand their powers in ways that they otherwise would find it much more difficult to do absent these particular details. They also bring a really nice comparative framework, and they're able to draw on lots of different kinds of cases. And I think that that also really enriches their scholarship. So you have their very impressive bios, so I won't go into them in great detail, but I just wanted to point out a couple of things. Kim Scheppele of Princeton University, one piece that I think is really foundational to this field is her University of Chicago Law Review, appropriately titled Autocratic Legalism from 2018. We also have Javier Corrales of Amherst College, and I also would point you to his recent book from Oxford University Press, Why Constitutional Change Often Fails to Enhance Democracy in Latin America. We'll have each of the presenters talk for about 7 minutes or so, and then if you have a question, use the raise your hand function in Zoom, and this will generate a list of people who can jump in, and I'll unmute you in the order that you appear. And then once you ask your question, I'll mute you and allow the presenters to answer. So let me now pass the virtual mic over to Kim Scheppele of Princeton University.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to put up a couple of slides here if you can see
excellent.
them. And first of all, I should say that actually I should not be going first because Javier Corrales actually was the one. No, I'm on the program as first. This is not a Tim Frye problem. But Javier Corrales really invented the vocabulary, and I borrowed this very much from him. So, you know, I come after him and was very much inspired by his work to actually pick up and use this term. So by going first, I don't want to claim that I invented this particular conceptual framework. So you can probably see my cursor there, right? Okay. So hang on. This is always the first problem because every Zoom session seems to have a different dynamic. There we go. Okay. So first of all, a lot of you will probably know these tables. So the VDEM project actually just produced its 2020 report, and I was just going to show you a couple of tables from their really excellent report and their even better graphics. This is a chart that shows in blue on the left the number of countries, and on the right the percentage of the world's population living under governments that were democratizing in blue, or as they put it, autocratizing in red. And a lot of the reason why I think we're here and why we're concerned about this topic is that what you see is this real spike in the in the percentage of the world's populations living under autocratizing regimes, and also the corresponding decline just in the number of countries that seem to be moving in a democratic direction. So this is one of the real trends, I think, that sparked a lot of us to think about this. And you'll see my cat walking below. This is the danger of working at home. This is another chart that I think really summarizes the kind of global picture of what's happening. This is a scatter plot where the scale along the bottom tells you the country in question's score on VDEM's Liberal Democracy Index, which is a combination of sort of electoral freedom and various kinds of civil liberties, and as well as separation of powers. They're one of the very few indices that actually builds in the kind of checks and balances issues that we've been concerned about. The 2008 score is along the bottom. The 2018 score is along the vertical axis. And if a country didn't change in that time, it should be hugging the line. And the countries that are above the line are countries that improved, and the countries below the line are the countries that have fallen. And the farther away you are from the line, the farther you've fallen in 10 years. So it's a handy kind of graphic representation of what's happening. And what you see is that in the countries in the kind of lower half of the Liberal Democracy Index, improvers actually seem to be winning over decliners. But in the top half of the scale, the movement is almost all down. part of that's a ceiling effect. It's hard to go up if you had a near perfect score to begin with, but a lot of it is exactly what brings us here, which is to say governments that used to be considered pretty reliable and stable liberal democracies that now have really taken major steps backwards toward in an autocratizing direction. What's striking to me, and again, I was inspired by Javier's work on this, is that in the countries that I know best, and most of those are the countries in Eastern Europe, though I've been broadening out and I'm eager to learn from the rest of you, what's been striking about this decline is the way that it hasn't used the old-fashioned, military coup, takeover, attack on and destruction of democratic institutions in plain sight. But instead, what we see is the use of law, what Javier and I have called autocratic legalism, to consolidate power in the hands of one person or one party, and to bring an end to democratic pluralism through changes to the legal and constitutional order. This stuff is happening by law, and that means unless you follow the law closely, it just looks like a kind of ordinary democratic transition. Now, to think about how this comes about, it's probably worth thinking about how stable are democratic constitutions to begin with. And this is where it seems to me that one thing the autocrats, and by the way, many of the autocrats, at least in my part of the world, are all lawyers, right? So Viktor Orban's a lawyer, Mr. Kaczynski in Poland, Putin in Russia, that in Eastern Europe in particular, literally the heads of state are what I call lawyers in chief. In other countries, and I would love to hear more about Turkey, Venezuela, it's not because the lawyers, the chief executives are lawyers, but they're clearly working with teams of lawyers to figure out how to undo constitutions. So sometimes what you see, and this was certainly true in Hungary as it was true in Germany in 1933, you see that a constitution has what we might think of as a resonant frequency point, a set of clauses and aspects that work together to make an autocratic takeover possible. And in Hungary, they had in place a disproportionate election law, because when the election law was designed in 1990, they were worried about 1 million small parties and difficulty making majorities. So there was a disproportionate election law that made 2/3 majorities in a parliament far more likely if, in fact, you had a small number of manageable parties. And they also had a constitutional amendment rule that said the Constitution could be changed by a single 2/3 vote in the unicameral parliament. What happened in 2010 was that Viktor Orban's Fidesz party won 2/3 of the parliament, not because they won 2/3 of the vote, by the way, they won 53% of the vote, but the election law magnified that into a 67% majority of seats. And then Orban could use that to change any provision of the Constitution by a single 2/3 votes. So, and they knew that before they ran for office. They were trying to find the 2/3. So this is one way that sometimes you find these governments coming to power. So often, at the beginning of these autocratic legalistic adventures, aspiring autocrats win elections, often fair and square the first time. Often by the second election, they've changed the rules so that they can't lose. And then they change the law. So from the outside to observers, it looks like, upstart wins election, then changes the law. What is there to talk about? That's how democracies are supposed to work, right? And that very often the laws that these autocrats pass are laws that look fine on their surface. So they often borrow tactics from good democracies. They claim double standards when they are criticized. And unless you really can see concretely how a particular law works in a particular context, it's very hard to criticize it from outside. So what do? So the constitutional structure itself becomes an object of change, either through constitutional amendment, as in Hungary, or wholesale replacement of the Constitution, as in Hungary, Venezuela, Ecuador, some other places, or massive constitutional amendments, which is what we've seen in Turkey, we're about to see in Russia, or through changes of laws that actually affect the constitutional structure, even if they're not in the Constitution themselves. So changes to the judiciary, extensions of term limits, removal of other checks on the executive. But the crucial thing is that all these things happen by law. I won't go through this slide in detail. Some of you have seen it before because it's a feature of almost all my presentations on this. But what's fascinating to me by looking at how a number of different these legalistic autocrats operate is how similar their script is. So they win elections on often populist platforms. And by the way, you know, this whole phenomenon is called by many others populism. And I've been one of the folks who's been fighting against that label, mostly because, at least in the parts of the world where I work, it's totally unclear whether the leaders in question believe their own act, so to speak. I don't think that necessarily the ideology is motivating these changes. The ideology is a cover for these changes. And so if you just focus on the ideology, I think it misses the point of how these things work. So populist platforms sweep these folks into power. They change or amend the Constitution. And here there's two patterns, and this is where I love the fact that we've got so many folks around the room working on different places. One pattern is to change the Constitution immediately. So this is Orban, this is Correa, this was, it's happened in Venezuela and some other places. But the other pattern is sort of the Erdogan-Putin pattern of staying in power a long time before the constitutional changes really kick in. And then the question is, so what turns them into this direction? But the Constitution is eventually a kind of object of gaming. The constitutional changes are not just random constitutional changes, but they tend to make politically dependent the judiciary, the media, and the civil sector. Those are the first three targets, because those are the ones who can tell, who can both expose what an autocrat is doing and tell him no. Another key feature is to put loyalists in particular positions. So it's important for these new autocrats to control especially the prosecutor's office, also the election office, tax authority, audit office, and the authority that picks judges. So again, the point is to kind of lock in this power and to remove all the checks. Rewriting particular laws is then a next feature. Often these are sort of in chronological order, but sometimes they're slightly out depending, but this is the usual order that we see. Rewriting particular laws, so changing the election laws, the laws regulating the civil sector, particularly their funding, laws regulating media, and laws on judicial selection. And while this is going on, there's usually a campaign not just to oppose the political opposition, which is normal in democratic politics, but to delegitimate the political opposition. They're funded by foreigners, they don't belong here, they don't have national interests at heart, their strings are being pulled by some foreign puppeteer, and so on. So this is the general picture. I've called some of these things the Frankenstate, because what you often see, if you think about Frankenstein, Frankenstein's monster, it was composed of what had been normal body parts by normal people, right? That the doctor digs up and stitches together in other ways. And so this is the metaphor for thinking about how you take normal laws from good democracies, but you stitch them together in a way that creates this monster. If you look at each one law separately, it's hard to see what's wrong with it. So what really is the problem here is the combination, right? Is the way these things have been stitched together to make some new monster. And so since time is short, let me just talk about one example, which is the one we've all been focused on in the last week. And since Hungary is the main country where I started developing a lot of these ideas, Hungary is now in the spotlight again. And as you know, a week ago today, actually the Hungarian parliament passed a new law, giving Orban extraordinary emergency powers to deal with the virus. Okay? And in doing so, it did a lot of things. And Orban clearly was designing this, as many of his designs, precisely in order to both take advantage of a moment when the world's distracted. He's done that before. After every European election, when all the EU institutions are changing leadership and everything is a bit in flux, he often acts very quickly during those periods when the EU is sort of in between leaders. But here he's acting when there's a virus emergency all over the place. And at some level, what the powers that Orban is given are powers that you see national leaders taking over everywhere. Okay, so what was this law? So one of the things the law does is it gives Orban decree power. So yes, you can pass decrees to deal with the emergency. That's happening in a lot of different places. What's different about the Hungarian law is that Orban's powers are essentially unlimited. So it's not limited in the law only to measures that deal with the virus. But more significantly, he's entitled to do anything to deal with the virus or the economic consequences that follow, which could be almost anything. Other countries have enacted fines for stay-at-home orders. So like if somebody is violating social distancing or stay at home, you see a lot of countries installing fines. In Hungary, they also punish violating these rules. But in Hungary, there's a criminal sentence of up to 8 years for doing so, which is to say way harsher punishments. And so people are afraid to get out. And by the way, the decree that set up the curfew, the lockdown order, happened 3 days before the law was passed. So it became impossible. Actually, the curfew was issued, then the law was put on the table of the parliament, then the law was passed. So there was a demonstration online, but that's very different than going to the streets. Other countries have postponed elections. In fact, there's a big discussion going on in a lot of places because elections require people to turn up and be there, often in large numbers at polling places. And so Orban has not just postponed elections, but canceled all elections for the duration of the emergency. And many countries have a time limit on their emergency decrees. There is no time limit on this. We have to wait for Orban to decide that he doesn't want to use these powers anymore. So it really is extreme. On the other hand, it is something that every country is doing, is putting countries into states of emergency. And Orban was hoping to hide under this. And in fact, what Orban's done in response to the criticism is to push back and say double standards. Why aren't you criticizing, the UK for having a lockdown order, et cetera? So again, he's trying to say we're just mixing and matching powers that other countries have used. But of course, it's totally different once you get up close and see it. So I just want to end, I have lots more I've written about this, but I just want to end by saying, like, how do we deal with this? And part of what I think we need to really push back on is this question of what it is that legal frameworks and constitutional democracy is for. The problem with autocratic legalists is that they're legalists, and they want to drag you into some legalist conversation about, can this clause mean this thing given the last 10 decisions of a court, right? Which is to say, they want to pull you into this expert discourse in which it is very easy to say up is down if you're a good enough lawyer. And I say this as a sometimes law professor, right? I think we need to back out a bit and ask, what it is that liberal democracy requires to stay in place, and to keep our eye on the ball, not of specific constitutional clauses, but on the point of the activity, which is to provide for the regular rotation of power, protection of rights, particularly of minorities, and checks and balances. We need to think about defending democracy, not just in terms of what the last election results were, but in terms of the possibility of future elections, a future rotation of power, and the maintenance of democracy over the long haul. So thanks.
Great, that was terrific. Let's hold questions for now, and I'll unmute Javier Corrales. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I'm super delighted to be here. Ayşe, thank you for the invitation and for organizing this. I was hoping I could also share my screen. Let me try to do that right away. 1 second. Clear that wasn't ready. Hold on. It'll be 1 more minute, maybe.
Yeah, Javier, there should be a share screen green button at the bottom of your.
Yes.
Okay.
I have it. It's just that I didn't have my PowerPoint selected. So, are you able to see it now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I want to say, I want to tell you all a story about the title of the piece that Tim and Kim talked about, where I first used the term autocratic legalism. Here in the United States, it often happens that you write something and the editors change the title of your piece, and they didn't like the term, and it involved a little bit of a fight. Normally, I'm pretty relaxed when editors tell me, let's change the title. But for this one, I was thinking, I really want to emphasize this because I don't know whether it makes sense in English or in general, but I kind of insisted, and I'm glad I did, and I'm delighted to see that others have found the term very useful. And Kim's piece right afterwards was just fantastic because it filled in so many of the gaps and so many of the precisions that my original piece didn't have. And so I just wanted to give you that anecdote, and let me now talk a little bit about what I want to discuss with you, and that is what we know and what we don't know. And let's see if I can do it in 6 minutes. And maybe I should just change the subject to what I know and what I don't know, because maybe some of you already know more about this. And I want to do a little bit of political science here. I want to, I'm teaching a class at Amherst, Democratic Backsliding, and these are some ideas that we are rehearsing with in class. And I want to think in terms of some of the trends that we're seeing in autocratization and what we know and what we don't know about this. And I am, of course, borrowing a lot from what Kim just showed us. So this is the order of what I want to talk about. And what we know, the main point I want to be able to convey is that this seems to be a winning formula to understand when is it that autocratic legalism is going to go forward and it's going to actually produce democratic backsliding. And that is, there has to be a certain degree of popularity for the president, but there needs to be some degree of asymmetrical party fragmentation. This is a description of the party system. I'm a political scientist and I'm focusing on the party system. Maybe it's too narrow a focus, but the idea is the autocrat is going to be able to change the law and get away with it without facing instability if his or her ruling party stays coherent and the opposition experiences some type of fragmentation. This is what we would call asymmetrical party fragmentation. It doesn't happen elsewhere, and there might be important exceptions, but this is the what I think I'm pretty persuaded at this point that this is the path to perdition, if you will. And then I want to show you on my latest paper that I'm working on electoral irregularities and how autocratic legalism also give us changes in electoral law, which Kim invoked, and I think it's an important point to make. And there, what I am trying to say is keep working with the idea of political parties. When is it that the question at this point is, when is it that we're going to see big pushes in the direction of more autocratic legalism, and when is it that we see some retreat? I'm not really sure whether I have an argument here, but I'm also going to try to study the idea of political parties and how they affect when is it that a president is going to rely on autocratic legalism or not. So let me show you this graph. My students in my class have seen this. I took, Kim mentioned the Liberal Democratic Index from VDEM, and I worked with the data differently, and this isn't very complicated, but what I have done here is, these are all the countries in the world since 1990 to 2018 that have shown continuous declines in this index. So the index goes from 1, which would be almost unattainable, perfect degree of liberal democracy, to 0. And the top, think of this as stock market charts. The top is the starting point. Where is it that they started? And so we don't know exactly where democracy is, but this area is pretty democratic, maybe above 0.4. So all these cases are cases of countries that started with some degree of democracy and started to slide down, democratic backsliding. These other cases are also cases of backsliding, but they start out with weak democracies. And so, as Kim mentioned, we're very worried about the cases that had stronger democracies and are experiencing these drops. And it's a lot of them. These are the cases here. It's looking back into the 1990s, so even back into the era where the trend was for rising democracies rather than declining democracies. And here is the biggest mystery that I think the field still needs to provide an answer for. Why is it that some countries, let me just show you this, actually let me skip to this one. Why is it that some countries, and these are the countries, go down as far as they go to reach a point of horrific autocracy, but other autocratizing states seem to stop somewhere before reaching a dismal point? Now, this is data up until 2018. It could very well be that Hungary, which is the second case here, has already dropped significantly. So Hungary seems unstoppable. Give it more time, perhaps. It could very well be that Turkey, which is right around here, has already come to this point. But we need to somehow, as I don't have an answer to this, we as scholars need to be able to understand when is it that we're gonna see a kind of stop here, or the liquid is gonna keep dropping. I don't think we really have an answer there. And at some point, maybe we or our graduate students or future generations will help us there. So this is where I think the biggest thing that we don't know. But now let me say a little bit about what, let me just, for the sake of time, I'll skip this one. And let me tell you a little bit about this chart, which comes from my book, which Tim Frye kindly mentioned. So one of the things that I looked at in my book is, when is it that presidents are able to manipulate the Constitution to change term limits, to relax term limits? We now know that this is a clear example of autocratic legalism. Some presidents go very far with this, others not so far, but it displays all the things that Kim was describing of the legal use of argumentation to make this seem as a democratic move, but in reality is a form of executive aggrandizement. And so these are the Latin American cases where you see an expansion of term limits. In other words, presidents give themselves more opportunity to stay in office longer. And this is where they try to get them and they fail. And the vertical axis shows the average approval ratings for these presidents. And the evidence is clear that as long as you have an approval rating above 40%, not even 50, 40%, you start to have a higher chance of changing this aspect of the Constitution. Now, you have a few exceptions here, but they're a minority compared to this very big group. So this is the argument on behalf of popularity helps you, and the popularity doesn't need to be that high. Already at 43%, some of these presidents have been able to get away with this change. Now, if you're here, this is where you're going to see failure at this. Now, this is the last set of ideas that I want to communicate, and then I'll come to an end. And this is the topic of electoral irregularities. And now I am going to focus on my case, Venezuela, tragic case in almost every dimension. It has always been said that in the current phase of autocratization, the one thing that we're not losing is elections. And that is true. But it is also very important for us to be aware that elections under autocratic legalism are becoming something else, something that doesn't really resemble free and fair elections as we know them. And that the way that these systems are transformed is, again, by the use, abuse, or lack of use of the law. So if you go through what scholars of electoral integrity have identified of norms that countries need to meet in order to qualify as electoral democracies, here's the list. I'm going to go kind of quickly, but so that we get a flavor of all the things that you want to be able to check off. Are you complying with the constitutional law? Are you manipulating the timing and scheduling of the elections? Are there voting day irregularities? Is there freedom from coercion? Is there an impartial allocation of public resources to candidates? Is there equal access to the media? Is there respect for the secrecy of the vote? Transparency in the voting process? Impartiality of electoral authorities? Impartiality of electoral laws? Official recognitions of results when they come in? Is there freedom for all actors to compete politically? Is there a mechanism to undertake reliable fraud investigation if the charges emerge? And is there normalcy in voter registration trends? And finally, do you respect the powers of elected officials once they're elected? So it's a pretty big checklist, and in a good democracy, you want to see most of these checked off. Let me show you how Venezuela, over time, eroded this system. I created this chart. Sorry, it's a little busy. Let me walk you through it. We have here all the elections that took place in Venezuela starting in April 1999 under Chavez, all the way to the most recent one, the 2018 presidential re-election of Maduro, Chavez's successor. And here you have all the norms of electoral integrity. Many of them are domestic, but other are sort of like international norms. And what I did was to count all the violations as we went along. And so in the very beginning, there's just a tiny little one, you know, an election for a referendum to create a constituent assembly that really wasn't contemplated by the law, but they figured out a way to do it. And then they kept having more elections and they were expanding the number. And by the time you are in 5 years into the administration, what has happened is the regime has populated the system with a very large number of irregularities at this point. Now, those in blue are coded blue to show that they have legacy effect. Like if, for example, you undermine the autonomy of electoral authorities and you keep working with it, that has legacy effect. If they have yellow colors, that means that it only affects that election. But take a look at this election right here when Chavez was facing a recall referendum. This was his lowest point in terms of popularity. And so this is where he displays his biggest assault on the electoral system. Here's the predicament. A lot of these other cells stay unchanged. So these autocrats are able to fool the world by saying, well, we've only changed a few things, but the essential elements remain intact. And people say, oh, okay, all right, I guess some reforms are still okay. But in terms of its cumulative impact, at this point, the system was set for the president to win. If I had more time, I could demonstrate how these changes were all incredibly self-serving. And here you go. The irregularities kept expanding from election to election. You don't see reversals. Maduro comes in, he faces less competitive electoral competitiveness, so he has a bigger incentive to really saturate the system. Now, when you get to this 2017 election, at this point, nothing has been left untouched for this election, which of course he wins, his ruling party wins. So let me conclude my remarks with what we need to know. What we don't know still in autocratic legalism is, why is it that some countries go very far with it, others don't? I emphasize the role of political parties as determining this game to some extent, but I also want to make sure that we understand that they're not everything, that other elements may play a role. In particular, the interaction of courts and parties. Kim mentioned this point, and it's worth highlighting. One area that these autocrats immediately know how to subdue is, of course, the courts. And in many ways, one could argue maybe this is the best predictor. The president who manages to undermine completely the court system pretty much owns the arbiter and therefore can get away with a lot of this legalistic manipulation. Thank you very much. Those were my remarks, and I'm very happy to hear comments and any questions you may have, but especially comments and rebuttals. Thanks.
Excellent. That was really, really great. Yes, we can all give a hands clap if. I'd like to start off with one question, and oops,
I think Tim is muted.
Thank you very. Is that better now? There we go.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. That was really, really terrific, and I think it just helps to lay out the playing field. As moderator, I'd like to abuse my power, aggrandize my authority. Although I think this might be within the legal limits of our Constitution for today. one thing that's always fascinated me about autocratic legalism is the potential for degrading the value of legalism the more you manipulate it. So on the one hand, we can think that autocratic legalism leads to kind of increasing returns to scale, in that as you change the Constitution, you're able to lock in different ways that you can aggrandize your power. So over time, it just becomes easier and easier to build your power. At the same time, the more one manipulates and changes a Constitution, I think a lot of people have argued that that's a way to degrade the Constitution as well. And I think Russia is an interesting case here, because for a long time, Putin has resisted the extension of his term limits. In the past, people have expected him to do this, and he hasn't done it. And it looks like this time around, he is going to, try to extend his term in office. And the argument that he often gave was, look, we need to protect the Constitution. And that's a very self-serving argument, because the Constitution was very favorable to him. So in his mind, he seems to recognize that there is this trade-off. If you start changing the Constitution, that that can also kind of weaken it as an instrument over time. So I would just be interested to hear what either of you have to say about this potential tension in autocratic legalism. Kim.
Yeah. So, oops, I think you can hear me. Yeah. So, so actually, Russia's a really interesting case, and Tim probably doesn't know this, but I worked at the Russian Constitutional Court.
I know this.
Yeah. And actually, at that time, what was interesting was that the presidential administration was preparing a new draft constitution that would have pulled what I think of now as the reverse Erdogan. So, Erdogan's strategy for consolidating power was to create the super presidency and then move himself into it, moving away from a parliamentary to a presidential system. Russia, which is a presidential system, they were contemplating, and I saw the draft constitution, of moving from a presidential to a parliamentary system, because Putin thought, United Russia was sort of the only party, and he thought he could go on forever being elected prime minister. And of course, in most constitutions, prime ministers don't have term limits as long as you maintain the confidence of the parliament. So they actually thought about that, and they rejected it for the Medvedev swap out, So there's a lot of different kind of tactics on offer here. But let me just say something about the general point on whether using all these legalistic things degrades the Constitution or the legal space. I think one thing that happens is that all these guys rely on, and all guys, interestingly, all these guys rely on the fact that legalism is beyond the average person, which is to say, it's a field of expertise where the lawyers can claim that they know what they're doing. And and weirdly, even though a lot of these guys reject expertise of all other kinds, they valorize legal expertise, and they can say to a public, this is really necessary, this is no different than Sweden, or or like what some other high value democracy. Or they say, like in the Hungarian case, they've been lately saying we're better than Sweden. They don't even have a constitutional court. So so it's very easy to use a kind of faux expertise to convince the public that what you're doing is really meets international standards, and that they better not criticize what the government is doing, because they'll just show themselves to be ignorant of how this works. So hiding behind this veil of legalism doesn't actually denigrate legalism. It denigrates common sense, right? Or it denigrates what people can see is happening before their eyes, because this fake expertise is dragged out and is designed to make people feel stupid when they criticize it. And that is also a kind of weapon in these battles.
Yeah, may I?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay, yeah. Absolutely interesting point. I never really thought of it in those terms. It is true that once you get the constitution that you kind of want, you become a big defender of it, and you block that. So there is an element to trying to preserve some legitimacy to the autocratic legal framework that you create, and that is an interesting instinct that these folks have. However, it should also be stated that along the lines of what Kim was saying, even if you experience some delegitimizing of the legality by constantly tinkering with it, that has a very chilling effect, mostly on the opposition. This is what makes the opposition feel like this is hopeless. We don't have recourses. And so it encourages all kinds of insane behaviors by the opposition. So if the autocrat is pushed to the point where he or she needs to really, really, really engage in enormous disorder at the level of legality, that in the end also helps to the extent that it might dissuade the opposition from using this avenue of contesting politics.
Great. Now I've got Elżbieta Matinha, who has a question. I'll turn to her.
In the first place, thank you very much. I'm learning here. I'm really, this is not, those are not things that I thought about a lot, but I particularly appreciate the formulation, the very concept of autocratic legalism. I try to use in my own little writings various formulas, and I never thought about that one, but I am not a lawyer. I wanted to say that, yes, indeed, there is something about constitution which is which is not necessarily this. No matter how people-friendly the constitution is, how small, how compact, there is something about it that that if you have power, you can perform it. Not power, but constitution. You can perform it as though you are acting according to the constitution. Yet, whatever you are doing, regulations, whatever, no matter how you call them, they are not really based, or not even close to what is happening in the constitution. I like us to think about it, because this is what really is helpful in taking the power. The Speaker of the Parliament appears in front of the audience of the large of the country and says, you know, starting tomorrow we are going to do this, that, and that, and it looks as though it is in the full light of legal power, that she has legal power. The Parliament didn't even vote that, and I don't know exactly how to. I mean, one would have to really put it aside and try to look at it closely. But the legal theater is not just verbal, but it has all sorts of extra tools from which are readily used by those who are at power and trying to appeal, trying to show that the work that they do is absolutely based on it's legal artists, yeah. So anyway, but it's not just words, it's not just text, and that those sometimes are actually not very well known, but the presentation of it and the performance of that.
Great, thank you very much. Javier, Kim, okay.
Actually, if I could just say one quick thing about this, because Elżbieta will know the Polish case particularly. She's a world citizen, but she knows the Polish case especially. And what's been so interesting in Poland is the way that, first of all, President Duda and this guy Kaczynski, who runs everything from the position of just being an ordinary MP, both have not just law degrees, but PhDs in law. And that makes them reluctant to actually change the Constitution when they don't have a constitutional majority, because they can't. And so what they've been doing is passing all these laws that affect the institutions that would tell them what they're doing is unconstitutional. And the opposition, to its great credit, has seized the Constitution itself as their symbol, right? So there are all of these huge demonstrations in which people hold these. I wish I had a picture of this sign that says Constitution, but it highlights the letters of the Constitution that say you and me, the familiar you and me, right? So it's this kind of great social movement. And I think that's one of the things that has really interfered with the ability of Kaczynski and Duda and PiS to push even farther than they might have, because the opposition sees this legal high ground, and that blocks some of these legalistic tactics.
I just want to add, this is a very interesting point, Elżbieta, thank you. In a presidential system, at least, there's only one actor who can declare that something is not constitutional. You're never going to hear the executive branch do it. It's the courts. The opposition may say it, the press may say it, it's the courts. That's the only actor that's designated with the authority to rule on this subject, which tells you why it's so important to have the court on your side. But then the implication of what has been said is that this has repercussions with the international monitoring of autocratization. Many times international actors will make determinations about democratic backsliding by saying exactly what Elżbieta has said. Well, how is the Constitution being respected or not? And if they see that there is some compliance with the Constitution, then they're like, okay, there's nothing we can do about it. And so it's terrible, the situation that you do see these presidents flaunting the extent to which they're complying with the Constitution, their reading of the Constitution. And this also silences international actors during this process. So going back to Tim's point, this is one more reason why these presidents have an enormous incentive to ensure that the legality that is self-serving has some degree of stability so that they can keep saying that they are complying with these norms.
Ayşe, can I ask, we're a little bit over time, but I'd like to ask one more question if I could. Is that allowed? Whoops.
Unmute yourself, Ayşe.
I did unmute it. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay,
We
good.
Started a bit late
Okay.
anyway, so please.
Good.
Go ahead.
I didn't want to usurp my power without getting the go-ahead from the powers that be. The one area I agree with all that's been said. It's been really great. One area is corruption, which we haven't talked about. It seems to be part of autocratic legalism, and that does seem to me to be the one area where it's not about the fine points and legal nuances. This is something that people understand, and that this is one potential weak point of autocratic legalism that the opposition can use in order to try to claw back some power from the autocrats. And to reference the Russian case again, you know, the main opposition activist is also a lawyer, Alexei Navalny, who made his name by using the same legalistic tactics of revealing abuses of corporate law for all to see in very plain language. So this was a kind of nice counterexample of somebody using the law for an anti-autocratizing a purpose. So I think we might want to think about some of the political consequences might be different for issues like corruption that might resonate more broadly versus, you know, the nuances of an electoral law and, you know, which one is more likely to lead to, you know, a democratic outcome where the average person, and frankly, the average political scientist doesn't really understand those nuances well. So I'll just throw that out there. I see Kim.
Yeah, if I can just say something about that. So even though, and I think it's true that corruption is the underbelly of all these regimes and that ultimately corruption will bring them down. But states also have this legal power to make it much harder for the opposition to figure out anything about corruption. So one of Orban's first decrees in the last week under this new state of emergency was a decree that keeps secret for 25 years all of the finances of the Belgrade to Budapest railway that's part of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. Okay, now that has nothing to do with the virus so far as we can tell. The train isn't even there yet. But that was one of the first decrees, and it was because the opposition was starting to zone in on this question of who was financing and what were the terms of the deal. And Orban has made a whole series of secret agreements with oil-rich, dodgy, states that don't have democracies, and all of these agreements are secret. Now, Tim will know this, but the government of Turkmenistan is not one of the most transparent governments on earth. And the way that I was able to find the Hungarian-Turkmen agreement, which was an energy cooperation in violation of EU law, was because I found it in Russian on the Turkmen website when it had been classified as a state secret in Hungary. So, one thing you see is that some of these highly corrupt governments use their secret classification powers to be able to make it much harder for the opposition to figure this out.
Just want to say that I completely agree. It's interesting to think about how some mechanisms to manipulate the law tend to be much more accepted by the public, are too ambiguous, but with corruption, that does produce more widespread clarity about what's wrong. It's a very important point to keep in mind, because as we think about what can the opposition do, Tim's point is absolutely important. Do a legalistic analysis of the status of corruption in your country and the impunity to which certain cronies are being treated, and that resonates. May not be enough, but it works.
Great. Let's have two more questions, and let's do both questions, and then we'll turn the floor over to the panelists, and I think we'll wrap up. I'll go first to Orçun Selçuk, and then I'll go to Valerie Sperling. So first, Orçun, go.
All right. Thank you for the presentation. I have a quick comment and question. I think we also need to look at how these autocratic legalists also change their own constitutions and change their own laws. Because in the case of Maduro, for example, right, he inherited Chavez's constitution, but if he again went with the so-called autocratic 1999 constitution, then he would have to do a recall referendum, which he didn't want to do it, and then he established another constitutional, mechanism, this time bottom up, without even going to the Chavez way, the popularity case. Similarly, in Turkey, after the transition to presidentialism, Erdogan issued more presidential decrees to correct his previous presidential decrees than the presidential decrees itself. So sometimes I think we should not overestimate these leaders and their capabilities to plan and manipulate the law in the long term. Because I think at the end of the day, most of these autocratic legal politicians, legalists, they're pragmatists, right? They are more concerned about their short-term gains than the long-term. Because then you can ask, why didn't Chavez, first initiate an unlimited, election in the 1999 constitution, and then he tried that in 2007 and 2009. In Turkey, similarly, now they've been talking about, oh, maybe we did it wrong, and we might have to, reform this presidential system and to make it, a little bit different. In 2010, there was another referendum in Turkey, which they did expand the constitutional court, and then put more loyalists, and then those loyalists later on turned against Erdogan, and then two of those constitutional court members, they were arrested. So I think it's also important to see the dynamic process of legal change, instead of, I think, assuming that these are legal geniuses. I think it's important to understand how their legal mechanisms are very pragmatic and ad hoc. And I agree with Javier, at the end of the day, it's about popularity. If they're not popular, then they will try to manipulate the law through legal mechanisms. And if they're not popular, then you would have I would say, an outright movement to dictatorship, which I think is going on in Maduro in the recent years.
Great, thank you very much. Let me go to Valerie.
There we go. Thank you for those great presentations. I also have just a quick comment and then a question. So the comment is about Putin and this, and you know, the idea that he resisted extending his term limits for a long time. I think maybe that's because Medvedev did it for him. You know, because when Medvedev came into power, one of his first acts was to extend the presidential term limit, not for him, but for whoever should come after him. You know, and so it went from 4 years to 6 years, and that effectively did give Putin a third term. So anyway, just that might be why we didn't see the this new round of constitutional changes until recently. But my question is, and maybe this is an appropriate question in the light of the virus and stuff, but what I'm wondering is, to what extent is this authoritarian legalism contagious? And what is the mechanism of contagion? Like, was there a patient zero, you know, that these different political leaders around the world observed and thought, I could go with that, and so how does it spread, I guess, is the question that I have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. That was great. Okay. I'll start with Kim. Give you a nice, easy question to wrap up the panel here.
Changes. Obviously, some leaders are better at this than others. And actually, Viktor Orban has been, I think, much better at this than all the competition, because there were many things he put in place that meant he anticipated every single crisis. So, for example, in his new constitution of 2011, they centralized a huge amount of power and took it away from mayors and regional governors. And I wanted to say this in response to Senem's, initial comments. What we're now seeing in some of these autocratic systems are oppositions which are concentrated in cities being able to win mayor's jobs. And Orban put into the 2011 constitution a clause through which he could just pull back all the powers from mayors. And in the last week, he's just done that. So, but that was already planted. So they're differently good at this stuff, and that leads me then to the next point, which was Valerie's point about contagion. So these things do spread, and, there's no illiberals international where they all meet and figure it out. And there's no, idea international or bad idea international that actually sends out consultants doing this. But what I've been trying to do in my work is to try to track, like, how do these things spread? And what you see is a lot of bilateral contact. So so we have so many Turkish experts on this conference. Let me say what I've been saying about Turkey, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But when the Constitutional Court was being captured by Erdogan, it happened in two steps, right? So first, the Constitutional Court's jurisdiction was expanded so that it could hear a lot more individual cases, what the Germans would call constitutional complaints. So the caseload of the court was massively increased. And then Erdogan put in a provision that expanded the number of judges so that it looked like it was a response to the increasing caseload and not an effort to pack the court. And a year later, Orban did the same thing, expanded the jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court, then expanded the number of judges. And what you can see is that there were literal plane flights of the foreign ministers first and then the justice ministers between the two countries before this happened. And so I think that there really are, like, state-to-state connections that accomplish this. And I can give you lots more examples of state-to-state connections now between Orban and Trump, actually. One last just thing on the 6-year term limit for Putin. Classic example of how it was difficult for the international community to criticize this, because, of course, France used to have a 7-year term that they had reduced to 5, right? And so when somebody says, but a 6-year term is too long, the Russians pushed back and said, yeah, but you never said that about France when they had a 7-year term, right? And also when France went from 7 to 5, no big deal. So why should going from 4 to 6 be a big deal? So a lot of times what the autocrats are looking for are these kinds of changes in other constitutional systems that nobody gets excited about, so that when they reproduce the same thing, they then say, oh, it's just because you don't like us. And, this is really nothing to do with the concrete legal change, which you didn't object to when some other country did it. So that's the kind of thing I mean by sort of hiding under the surface of the approval of other good states.
Great. Javier, do you want to wrap this up?
If I may, just very quickly, Orchan's first point, an opportunity for me to say that when popularity begins to decline and the incentive to begin to manipulate the legal systems more aggressively increases, there the study of referendum is essential. I think the field of autocratic legalism has to work closely with people who study how the presentation of referenda to the population is so vital, because they have an advantage there. It's a competitive process, but it's very important that we study the use of referenda. And on the question of contagion, it could very well be said, Valerie, that next to military doctrines, legal doctrines are some of the ones that are easiest to transmit from country to country. The legal profession outside of the United States is very transnational. And many of these leaders, we now know this from studying their foreign policies, going back to what Kim said, become active transmitters. So it's not that these things are floating out there. They find countries that are receptive to these, and then they begin to be active transmitters. So in the case of Venezuela, when Chavez changed the constitution, there is plenty of evidence to suggest that he, as a matter of official foreign policy, provided legal technical advice to other countries who were willing takers. So there is a combination. So in many ways, perhaps one could say that autocratic legalism, of all the practices of illiberal politics, is one that lends itself the most to contagion, perhaps.
Great, thank you very much. I'm sure that we'll hear a lot more about these issues as we go forward with the next couple of panels, but please join me in giving our presenters a real big round of applause. Thank you very much. I'll pass it over to Ayşe now, and that she can tell us what's next on the agenda.
Okay, I will actually turn the floor to Turku. She will be moderating the second session. So thank you all very much.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. My name is Turku Isıksel. I teach political theory at Columbia, and I'm chairing the panel on authoritarian backsliding in Europe and the US. I'm going to give a very brief introduction to the speakers, meaning just name and affiliation, and order of presentation. So the first to go will be Professor David Driesen, who is university professor at the Syracuse University College of Law. Second will be Professor Dan Kelemen, who is professor of political science and the Jean Monnet Chair in European Union politics at Rutgers University. And last but not least, we'll hear from Professor Elżbieta Matynia, who is professor of sociology and liberal studies and the founding director of the Trans-Regional Center for Democratic Studies at the New School for Social Research. I'm going to ask each of our speakers to keep their remarks to about 5 to 7 minutes, as we've been instructed by Professor Kadıoğlu. And after that, we'll have a brief Q&A. So thank you, Professor Driesen, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. The point I want to make today is a pretty simple one, which is that the international experience teaches us that the United States unitary executive theory provides a pathway to autocracy. Now, the unitary executive theory is a US constitutional theory that the president must have complete control over the executive branch, including the authority to fire all important executive branch officials for political reasons. And this is debated in parochial terms in the US, with the number of people, conservative jurists and scholars, arguing that the original intent of the Constitution requires this result, and others saying, no, we have always had what's called internal separation of powers, where there are independent agencies and traditions of prosecutorial independence, and those are all constitutional and they all make sense. But what I've done in the article that I shared with you in a book that I'm writing is to study particularly the democratic decline in Hungary, Poland, and Turkey with an eye to examining what the experience has been, not so much with the courts, but with executive power. And what one sees in all well-functioning democracies is that they have a fairly robust internal separation of powers, or at least all that I'm aware of. And certainly in Poland, Hungary, and Turkey, that was the case. That is, there's a fair amount of either independence or multi-party involvement in key bureaucracies like the prosecution service, the media authority, and the electoral commissions. And what the authoritarians have done to foment democratic backsliding in all these countries is to change these institutional arrangements. Now they use, so it seems like, democratic means to change these institutional arrangements. They do this through acts of parliament, either constitutional or ordinary legislation, or in the case of Turkey, through referenda. And they change the structure so that effectively the head of state has control over these key bureaucracies. It may not be only him, it may be through his party to some extent, but they set it up so that these formerly independent institutions lack independence and neutral experts are put into exile. And once they do that, of course, they then use these bureaucracies to undermine the rule of law, tilt the electoral playing field, and shrink the public space for debate. And so you see prosecution services that persecute opponents of the regime, but give corrupt supporters a free pass. We see media authorities acting to turn public broadcasting into propaganda outlets of a very virulent sort. And then we see them, along with other parts of the government, subjugating independent media, bringing media properties within control of media conglomerates supporting the ruling party. And so that's the kind of thing that we see going on. I can say more about that, but I think you all are pretty familiar with it. And so my challenge has been, in addition to documenting this and sort of enriching the description of how this is going on, trying to figure out how to make the case that this should matter for US practice, because of course, as some of you have suggested, the US courts are relentlessly parochial. And that is certainly true of the modern court. And I've made several moves in the article and in the book to try to get around that problem. One is to simply point out that the case that the founders favored the unitary executive theory turns out to be quite weak. In fact, Alexander Hamilton promised those ratifying the Constitution that the Senate would control removal of executive officers, not the president. And that is consistent with the only clause in the Constitution that authorizes removal. That is a clause that authorizes the Senate to remove the president. So they're countertextual arguments, but it's not so clear that the court should be completely confident that this is the original intent. And so with that opening, there are two things the counsel that comparative experience might be appropriate. One is that the founders themselves examined European practice extensively in crafting the Constitution, so maybe we ought to follow their example. And then the other thing is that there is in our constitutional tradition some reference to foreign cases. It's not a proclivity of the modern court, but we've done this before. One sees in statements by Justice Brandeis, Senator Webster, and other Supreme Court justices, Justice Story, who's a legendary early Supreme Court justice, some recognition of the tendency of giving the president removal authority, unconstrained removal authority, to foster authoritarianism. And we also see, actually, in the most famed separation of power case in US constitutional law, the Youngstown case, an extensive discussion by Justice Jackson, a former Roosevelt advisor and a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, an extensive discussion of democratic decline in the Weimar Republic. And it's longer than the doctrinal passages we teach in constitutional law in the excerpted case books. But what you see is both Jackson and Frankfurter, and even a little bit Black, rely on this foreign experience to help justify the case that provides the leading frameworks for analyzing issues of presidential power. So it's not unprecedented for us to learn something from experience abroad, and we ought to do this in this case. So my conclusion is that the experience abroad suggests this unitary executive theory is a pathway to autocracy. There's a case before the Supreme Court where the Trump administration is asking us to go down that path, and the Supreme Court should reject that.
Thank you very much. Dan Kelemen?
Yeah, my talk's going to focus on arguments I made in this article that was circulated about the EU's authoritarian equilibrium, but I'm going to try to emphasize in particular more the relationship with the theme of autocratic legalism. All right. So, oh, here we go. Wait, slideshow. Okay, there we go. So yeah, the puzzle that I focus on, it's related to our topic today, is why would the EU, which professes to be a democratic union, be committed to democracy and the rule of law, tolerate member states becoming competitive authoritarian regimes, or possibly, in light of Orban's latest moves, even dictatorships, right? And how, in essence, how can these regimes which practice autocratic legalism survive within the EU? The first message I have is that actually maybe this puzzle isn't much of a puzzle at all. We shouldn't be surprised, because the comparative politics literature, particularly on Latin America, a bit on the early US, tells us that having authoritarian states within democratic unions is quite normal, right? It's seen all over the world, especially in sort of large heterogeneous type federations, of which the EU is one. And in essence, what I say, borrowing from that literature, is that authoritarian states survive in the EU for the same reasons that they do in those other polities. It's a combination of party politics, funding from the center, and immigration. I want to say a couple things about each of those. But then I also emphasize that the EU is actually probably in worse shape than some of the historic examples of this phenomenon, because it seems to be trapped in this, what you can call an autocracy trap or an authoritarian equilibrium. And the basis of that authoritarian equilibrium are threefold. That in essence, in terms of party politics, the EU has sort of enough partisan politics to create incentives for political parties at the EU level to shield autocratic legalists and these local autocrats, people like Orban or Kaczynski, but it doesn't have enough politicization to create incentives to throw them out of office, dislodge them. And I'll say more about that in a minute. Secondly, autocrats can use EU money to prop up their regimes, but so far very few strings have been attached to that. So EU money, some federations use funding as leverage eventually to put pressure on autocrats. So far it's just been help and not leverage in the EU. And then finally, with emigration, people who don't like the situation can just leave, and that, as Hirschman taught us 40 years ago, the possibility for emigration exit reduces pressure on autocrats, helps them survive. So yeah, as a result, the EU is trapped in this kind of half-baked, like inverse Goldilocks situation, not too little politicization, not too much, just the wrong amount. And where this, I think, relates to autocratic legalism, that article I mentioned, I concluded saying, well, this is bad, but at least while the EU may not make sure its member states are not or remain democracies, it probably prevents them from being full-blown dictatorships. In other words, they have to kind of limit themselves to autocratic legalism. They can't go for full-blown Putin-style coercive dictatorship. But I think I may have been being too optimistic, right, in light of our most recent developments that Kim mentioned. And this kind of raises a question a lot of people ask me all the time, and I ask Kim, well, what exactly would Orban have to do to provoke a meaningful reaction? Would he have to do mass arrests? What are the boundaries of autocratic legalism, and sort of when does it, can it no longer be disguised as within the law? And, I think the other thing I want to mention is that, in part by playing this game of autocratic legalism in a context like the EU inside a larger federation, the autocratic legalists, they count on the Democrats at the EU level, the people who care about democracy and rule of law. They count on those people taking the law seriously and kind of debating them on all this Frankenstate stuff that Kim was mentioning. But really, what's happening is they are kind of convincing the EU to bring a legal pad to what is really a street fight, right? Because the autocrats don't take the law very seriously. They pretend to, but for them, it's just a guise for a power grab. Okay, so just quickly, I don't have time to go through all this, but in the paper, I talk about this party politics, how if the authoritarian delivers votes to a national party, they will be tolerated and even protected. We saw that in the US historically. And sorry, just skip over a couple of things. I'm running out of time, so I'll just go quickly. The essential message is that, the key reason that Orban gets away with what he does is that he has a protector at the EU level, the European People's Party, or as I like to call it, the European von Papen Party, right? Merkel, the paragon of liberal democracy, is actually been Orban's biggest supporter for a decade, and other EPP figures like Manfred Weber. And now Ursula von der Leyen is blocking EU action against Orban. She was elected with the help of his votes, okay? And just skip ahead. I just want to say it goes beyond EPP and Orban. You see similar phenomena with other parties protecting pet autocrats. There's the ECR and Kaczynski. Even the liberals have a pet autocrat in Czech Republic. Okay? And then very quickly in my last minute, I just say funding also plays into this. Basically EU funding works like the resource curse, like rents from oil, where it supports autocracy. There's all this work on how the funding from the EU funds Orban's autocracy. And the key in terms of legalism is, the EU hasn't attached meaningful conditions in terms of compliance with rule of law or democracy, even though they could. In fact, they could exercise this, but for political reasons, they haven't, okay? Skip over some of this. Last thing I talk about, is emigration. That's less maybe relevant to our theme today of legalism, but essentially dissatisfied citizens have been exiting in huge numbers, which is a pressure release valve for such regimes. Here's the most striking figure. That's the percent of citizens living in other EU member states in the first 8 years of the Orban autocracy, 2010 to 18, and the figure on the right where the emigration has surged out of line with everywhere else, that's Hungary. All right, so just to conclude, the EU is stuck in this authoritarian equilibrium. The EPP shelters Orban, Orban shelters Kaczynski in Poland, who's in a different party. Orban maybe could get kicked out now, but by now he's in place and can go to another party. EU membership has restricted Orban to the tools of autocratic legalism that Kim and Javier and others have talked about, those kind of tools. But he seems to be shifting now to blatant dictatorship with his Corona coup. So, that doesn't give us a lot of reason for optimism, and the rot seems to be spreading. All right, I hope I stayed in my time mostly.
You did very admirably, thank you, Dan. And Professor Martinez. You're muted. Let me unmute you.
I made a mistake, and I have much more to talk about it, but I'm going to be trying to be disciplined, and I will try to do my absolute best to focus on what I should focus. So there's three things I wanted to talk about, in fact, three sets of information, and I will try to manage them. If you didn't notice, I did go and change, and I have now a Constitution t-shirt. We can talk about it later. It's a very important and precious part of my wardrobe. So I'd like to talk briefly about three sets of my observations regarding developments in Poland. Some are better known than others. And the one which is very, very well known is that, of course, Poland lags behind Hungary when it comes to the speed of democratic reversal. Those are slow in Poland by, yes, considerable resistance from civil society, but perhaps what is less known, that resistance is underpinned by an absolutely remarkable system of laws, which is related to territorial self-government. Those were the laws which were enacted in Poland very early, in March 1990, but discussed and debated and workshopped for at least a decade, if not longer. There was a private seminar in the 1970s when people were talking about it. It was officially a kind of working group during Solidarity period and afterwards. So when 1989 came, Actually, the law was almost there and was introduced fairly early on. I'm talking about it because at the core of that law, I'm talking about it because it has a repercussion to the different version of autocratic legalism in Poland. Perhaps not different version, but different ways in which something that obviously Kaczynski would aspires to, it's not very easy sometimes to manage. So at the core of that was of the laws regulating the local self-governments, establishment of local self-governments was a fairly radical breakup of the monopoly of the state. I really think it is much further, that particular reform went much further than any other done in this kind of new wave of democracies after 1989. Self-governments have their own considerable budgets, and the decision-making processes shifted to the places where people actually lived and work, and that makes a difference on the ground, and it does make a difference. Today, exactly, well, it is 30 years later, the local self-government, I think, in Poland, it's one of the dimensions of democratic governance that is not only constitutionally guaranteed and people know it, but actually they know it and they practice it, and the autonomy is of those local powers is cherished and staunchly defended by the citizens. I like to talk about it because it's otherwise it adds this one layer of perhaps understanding why things are not always going the way Kaczynski would like them to go. Of course, I know that yes, Budapest won, and that in Turkey, all those big cities, we do know that. I think there is what is interesting in Poland are those smaller places too. So the transition from democracy in Poland was launched, as you know, in 2015, when a majority government elected by a minority came to power. It was 37%, 37.58% of the state vote, of the vote that they got. They won with the centrist civic power, civic platform. And very quickly they began to do what they wanted to do. They very quickly embarked on the major project against the institutions of the rule of law. And I don't have to talk about it because you do know about it. We all know about it. The Constitutional Tribunal and Supreme Court, but also against judges themselves, claiming that the majority of them were remnants of the communist system and trying to force them to retire, even those who really didn't have much to do with communism. After all, it was almost 30 years later. And then the parliament began, the processes that we know from somewhere else, rubber stamping all laws proposed by the executive branch. And there was this president, Duda, who some people thought, oh, well, he is a lawyer, he will have a little bit of independence. No, he did not. He, as a mere lackey of the party chairman. The chairman doesn't have a position. Yes, he is a lowly member of the lower house of the parliament of Sejm. The chairman, Kaczynski, is not charismatic. He doesn't fit some of those scripts or scenarios that we see around. He sits at the back. He doesn't talk. Would he talk, he would lose rather than he taps his fingers. That's what he does. He is he's not charming. He's not magnetic, but he has incredible power over his party. I try to capture in my piece on killing the democracy how did they manage to actually win in 2015. There are various reasons. One of them, I think, is the development of the story, the development of the frame that provided a possibility for the election, which is a conclusion or a fairly popular a successful story that democracy is conspiracy of the elites. It was conspired. It was done in 1989 at the roundtable, and here the savior of the nation will come. Savior of the nation is Kaczynski. He, in one of his early interviews in the early 1990s, he said that he would like to retire as a savior of the nation. It comes, and things will be different now. People will know what is what, who is who, and so on. I'm not going to go into it. I wanted just to say that instead of, in case of Poland, we're talking about the charismatic leader or a leader even, which is there in front of the people. I like to turn into something else. I like to suggest that there is something else at work here, something other than charismatic leader who could rally the people. And it is there's another potent source of power, which is an event. Kim mentions this in her brilliant piece when she refers to transformative events. A word about that event. A colleague of mine, Robin Wagner-Pacifici, you might know her, argues in her fabulous book on event that social life is really inclusively framed and redirected, not just by institutions and processes, but by certain events, which can be effective in changing shapes, in shape-shifting shapes, but also they are also I would add unpredictable. They emerge, they gain momentum, they flow forward, and they sometimes get bogged down. What is interesting here, I think, for us is that events are those events that really threaten liberal democracy, its rights and freedoms, and above all, the ways that are in which events could be resisted, or perhaps redirected or reconfigured. I'm talking about it because I mean, this is what interests me, what to do about it. So, the whole beginning of the legalistic emergence of the legalistic autocracy in Poland is connected to the event of this famous horrific crash of the airplane when 100 government officials were killed, and what was behind it, that they went to mourn the death of murder of 22,000 Polish officers in Katyn and so on. And I like to think, and I'm not going to go to it because I understand we don't have time, but I like to think that there is something that is happening today. Which might have an impact, or it may be another transformative event that actually is taking place as we talk right now, here via Zoom. And the outcome of which is, I think, perhaps more difficult to predict, as it is not confined to the Polish nation state. And it's anyway a difficult thing for many of us to comprehend. And this is a pandemic. The reason the pandemic in Poland is now important is because in 5 weeks there are going to be elections. The elections that were planned, that they were designed, they were comprehended, they were carefully scripted to make sure that the chairman has for 5 more years his apprentice, President Duda, who signed any law he would like him to sign. He needs this 5 extra years. So in just 1 month, at the time when Poland may be facing the peak of the pandemic, in politically crucial events is to take place, the presidential election, what is going to happen? They were scheduled only on February 5th, and they were scheduled in the closest possible legally possible date, which is May 5th. Very short period. Opposition tried to oppose. We need time for electoral campaign. No, that decision was made very quickly and signed by the parliament. And today, the politics around the elections that the government is pushing for might illuminate, in my opinion, the very phenomenon we're discussing here, the phenomenon of autocratic legalism, as well as both the present and the future of the autocratic legalism. I like to only mention very briefly the legal looking also steps related to the elections. If conducted as planned, they represent an indisputable health hazard, of course, to the population. So on March 20th, a bit over 2 weeks ago, Poland announced imposition of the state of epidemic. Now, there is nothing in the Polish law that talks about the state of epidemic. There is something which is called a state of natural disaster. State of epidemic, set of regulations that affect civic freedoms and are introduced by state administrations and not by the elected officials, by the Ministry actually of Health. I'm going to skip that, the comment on what is in that particular state of epidemic law, what kind of regulation it is. Actually, it is not a law. But there is another law in Polish constitution. Under the set of emergency laws, there is a law which is called, there could be a martial law, and there could be something which is called natural disaster, the state of natural disaster. The state of martial law, the state of natural disaster, which constitutes a grid of interconnected regulations. Now, the government, the regime, the Kaczynski didn't want to have it, even though it gives them certain powers, gives certain powers to the executive branch, because these laws have a very strong major consequences for an upcoming elections. If the law of natural disaster is introduced, you cannot have elections. You cannot have elections, they have to be postponed. They have to be postponed at least 90 days after legal ending of the state of natural disaster. Why I'm talking about it? Needless to say, peace doesn't want it, as they realize that things won't be looking so good for them by that time. The economic situation in Poland is already rather sad. As you know, Poland did not go through 2008, successfully actually went through the 2008 economic crisis. At this point, it's already clear that that economy, also because of the moves that the government done before, economy is going to be horrific. So they stay with this introduction of this weird thing called the state of epidemic. At the same time, of course, the elections are coming, and how the elections are going to conduct it. Majority of the opposition, the candidates resigned because they cannot conduct a proper electoral campaign. And the government announced, having virtually one candidate at the moment, which is Duda, announced that they are going to have elections by mail voting. There's no infrastructure, nobody knows how it happened. There are great questions that the press, whatever there is an independent press, there is independent press, there is very little independent electronic television, but the press is all against it. So here is the answer from the government. Well, actually, we have such a law, and in the part there were some people who would vote by mail, and those were disabled. Now we are disabled, and now we are expanding that to entire population who has to stay home. So there are countless appeals and a protest. But it seemed that the termination of Chairman Kaczynski, despite the fact that the majority of the population is trying to is supporting the scheduling of the election, but he doesn't want it. He's like a tank. He pushes ahead, and no wonder, because this vote would ensure the re-election of Duda.
Forgive me for interrupting. Yes. Can I ask you to conclude so we'll have some time for Q&A?
Okay. Let me just skip everything I have and go to the last paragraph. A few days ago, a Speaker of the House declared that rescheduled the election would be unconstitutional, and perhaps indeed it would be. But so it would be the change of the electoral law, while the electoral campaign is supposedly on, and there is a changing the way in which people are voting. So here's my and it seemed to more and more people that actually the election may not happen. And I like to ask a question. I'm asking that question myself. Kaczynski calculated that rescheduling and not using the state of disaster will bring electoral disasters for peace. So here my question is, could this strange event that we ourselves cannot comprehend, do not comprehend yet fully, the pandemic, be hijacked to benefit the consolidation of autocratic legalism, or might it, under certain condition, just passively, serve to topple it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I see that Professor Kadıoğlu is virtually raising her hand, so please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. I cannot seem to put that hand down. You can hear me, right? Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much for these presentations. I have always been thinking about, this comparison between Hungary and Poland, because the way I see, EU policies, in fact, did have an impact in Poland, whereas, they don't seem to make any difference in the case of Hungary. And I always wondered about the reason for that. And I actually, the first time I met Dan Kelemen was, when he gave this brilliant talk at Harvard Center for European Studies last year. And I remember, having this impression. So now I'm asking you the question now, actually, because you also alluded to it then. This EPP, I like the expression European Van Papen Party. That's what I'm going to use from now on. But it seems like these European parties, that were in fact, that came about for further democratization, are at the end of the day maybe harming democratization. Can we say that? Because could it be because Hungary, is part of the Fidesz is part of EPP, whereas Kaczynski's party piece is not part. This seems to have an impact. So it's like a dialectics almost. The seeds of destruction are within the system. So I've been wondering about that. So that is my question.
Thank you very much. And since we're running short on time, I'm going to collect some questions. So Professor Aydın Düzgit is next.
Okay. Yeah, you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I also had a question for Dan Kelemen. I actually read the JEP article recently. I think it's fantastic and very timely as well. And after reading the article, I remember reading the statement of some of the member states about the situation in Hungary without even mentioning Hungary and Orban, which Orban actually signed in the end as well, which I thought was very ironic. But anyhow, I have the impression that, sorry, it's just my daughter. Okay. So, I just had the impression that on the one hand, what we've seen with the pandemic, we see the sort of north and south divide that's being accentuated again, just right after it was similar to the way it was after the Eurozone crisis. And I also have the feeling that with, what's been happening with Orban and Hungary and all that statements has shown that perhaps we're talking about sort of the East-West and the old and the new member state divide as well. That's kind of seems to be taking shape to some extent. And whether or not the old member states could or would be willing to do anything about it, or legalistically, whether it would be possible for them to do something.
Thank you. And I'll also take a question from Professor Scheppele.
I've already spoken quite a lot on this, but I just want to mention something that may be a bit of an answer, but also sort of a question to particularly Elżbieta and Dan. That one of the differences between Hungary and Poland is how good they are at legalistic autocracy, which is to say that Hungary, because of the ease of changing the constitution, was able to bring in a new constitution, and all the way along, Orban's been very careful about doing everything legally in Hungary. So if it violates EU law, that's a different question. He also was very careful to avoid trampling too hard on EU law. Whereas in Poland, because the constitution was in many ways better designed, it took longer to write actually in the 90s, the Kaczynski government is basically unable to change the constitution. So what's happening in Poland is illegal in Poland. And I think the EU saw that and they were able to act more quickly. So if we're talking about legalistic autocracy as a framework for thinking through some of these issues, it might be worth asking not just how good the practitioners are, but how many barriers there are within a particular system to actually being able to completely take over a constitutional regime and make everything legal within. And then I guess the question to Dan and Elżbieta, and to some extent to David too, is how far constitutional systems are really resilient to these kinds of takeovers. And maybe since no one's asked David a question yet, what I'll do is ask David. The US Constitution is very short. It actually says very little. So is one of the problems that we're simply getting insufficient guidance from constitutional level systems at this stage.
Thank you. Other questions? You can also show me your hand. No. So if our speakers could take a couple of minutes each to address the questions, then I think we should be doing well in terms of time. So Professor Driesen, would you like to start?
Well, sure. I'll take on the last question about the barriers. I think what's interesting is that the US Constitution is I don't think the brevity of the Constitution is a big problem. Because actually, I think as the constitutions get longer, their ability to have any force among ordinary people diminishes. So they perform a political function. They can be ignored and sometimes are. So I don't think it's a brevity question. But to my mind, the difficulty of I think you're right about the difficulty of amendment makes a big difference. So in Poland, they violated their constitution. They just captured the court first, so there'd be no forum to get that recognized. In Hungary, they were able, because of the way the constitution is set up, to actually amend it, and because the fact that they did get a majority, which translated into a 2/3 majority. In the US system, interestingly, I think the case before the Supreme Court now on this unitary executive theory is basically asking the Supreme Court to amend the Constitution. Because amending the Constitution by democratic means in the US is virtually impossible. And the courts are in this sort of activist common law tradition where they might amend the Constitution to create this unitary executive. So so there hasn't been much, and the executive practice, which they can control, is sort of changing the Constitution. So the mechanisms and the points of resistance are different. And I think that does make a difference.
So I think that there are some things indeed built into the Polish constitution, and I remember we might also remember people were incredibly frustrated because it took 8 years for the Polish constitution to be prepared and then to be voted only in 1997. But there are certain things built into the constitution that are not easy, are difficult to dismantle. I mentioned that local government thing, which is rarely thought about it because it seemed as though, all right, so every other country has it. It's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary arrangement. It's an extraordinary set of laws, which people fell in love with, and this is something that and they see how the government, Kaczynski government, the mayors see, the people on the lower and so-called commune level see how they are being punished for what they are doing, and that they are given much more obligations by the government to do stuff, that the money is taken away from them, and it seemed to me that in the process people are kind of beginning to appreciate the constitution. Constitution is begun to be good, big thing in Poland. Yes, indeed. This T-shirt that I have here, it says, "Yes, you and me, Constitution and me." It's a big deal there. I wanted to say that. So the partly is constitution, part of that is constitution. People began to read it and they sang it, and there was something about it that it is a living, it became a live document. I don't want to exaggerate it, but since I'm not a lawyer, I usually see how it works kind of socially, and that began to work. The other thing that is, it's a complicated thing. It's this, and having to do with EU, with all this autocratic aspirations by the peace and its people. Poland has one of the biggest, and I'm not going to give a percentage right now, but the biggest support for the European Union. When it comes to the population, the percentage are really, really very high. I don't remember, 70% or something like that. So it's a very difficult, again, it's one of those contradictions that make the situation of Poland perhaps interesting, but not necessarily easy to explain, because one would have to go and find more of them, and there are more of them.
Thank you. Professor Kelemen?
All right. Well, Kim answered half of my question, the question that was posed to me already, and the question on what's the difference, the first question from you, and what's the difference between the reactions to Poland and Hungary, and I agree completely with Kim that half of the difference is that the Polish regime was much more blatant about violating its own constitution, its own laws. The Hungarian regime was much more serious about limiting itself to autocratic legalism and staying, at least framing that what it was doing was within its own laws. The other big difference, though, I think, in addition to that factor, is that Orban had more powerful friends, right? Because he was in the EPP, whereas PiS was in the ECR, where the most powerful other party other than themselves was the Tories, who were a diminishing asset, obviously, as they were on their way out the door, right? And this doesn't just play out, I think, within the parliament, although that's one key place, but it also plays out within the council and even within the European Commission, where even though they're supposed to be neutrally serving the pan-European interests, some of those commissioners clearly are strongly attached to their party background. So yeah, I think that's a big part of the difference, and I'd written about that in some earlier articles. On the question about the East-West divide, I don't know. I always resist that. Because first of all, I feel like it's a total insult to all the Democrats in the East, right, who are fighting to defend their countries against these autocrats. And then secondly, even in this recent EPP statement, let me rephrase and just say, definitely there's more support for these regimes in the East, right, than on average. But on the other hand, the most important support for Orban comes from Germany, from the CDU. That's the most important. And secondly, even within the East, like in this recent EPP statement, right? Baltic countries signed on. I think Slovakia also signed on, whereas the French, Spanish, and German conservatives didn't, right? So, and then I guess the last thing, I just want to slip in one comment. We don't really have time to go back maybe to David, but just on the US system and federalism, I just lay out a thought for maybe all of us, that something I'm working on with other colleagues and thinking about a lot, in terms of federalism. It just strikes me that, the framework I gave showed how a democratic federation might protect local autocrats, right? And we're seeing that in the EU. We saw it in US history with the Democratic Party protecting the autocratic South. But on the other hand, the question is, to what extent, when an autocrat is trying to take over the whole country, like Trump, to what extent can federalism block him? That's something I'm working on a lot. Can California and New York save us? And we're seeing, of course, in the run-up to November, I think that's going to be a pitched battle, whether those states can ensure electoral integrity, or whether, the Trump working with Republican governors can kind of undermine that.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think federalism is a potential resource in resisting autocracy. And I think we see that in Turkey, right, where you get municipal victories of the minority party. And in the US, one place this comes in, I mean, one of the ways in which Trump has copied Orban to a T is in demonizing outsiders and going after immigrants. And his immigration policies emulate more of Orban's on an enormous level of detail, actually. But one of the things he tried to do was to deputize the states to implement the deportation of immigrants. And in a decision that I disagreed with, because I think it's bad constitutional law, but a number of years ago, the court set up this federalism principle that you can't tell state officials what to do. The federal government can't do that. You can't deputize them. That's seen as an increase, as an interference with state autonomy. That resulted in a quick reversal of that executive order. It was eliminated by the courts. The Justice Department never appealed it because they didn't have a leg to stand on, at least not to the Supreme Court. And since then, he's pursued the same means through things that are more legally plausible by trying to withhold law enforcement grants. But he's lost most of those cases as well. And he won one recently. So his effort to turn the states into vassals has been thwarted. He's trying to do the same with environmental policy. And now he's resisting the coronavirus because Trump won't lead against the coronavirus. He's going to play politics with that. So the states are beginning to form consortia to buy medical supplies, and his Justice Department is threatening with antitrust prosecution. But it still shows that there's a resistance to sort of an autocratic move of using the need to combat the crisis as a way of subduing political opposition by demanding fealty from governors. That might be circumvented by consortium arrangements among states. So federalism is, I looked at the history of the South too, and I agree it is a great case study in authoritarianism within a supposedly democratic system. On the other hand, it is a potential resource to resist autocracy.
Thank you all very much. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Kadıoğlu. I believe we have a 10-minute break coming.
Okay. Yes. Thank you very much. This was a great panel. So let's take a full 10-minute break and then come back. Okay, great. Great to have you all back. So we're going to go into our third session. This is really going well. I'm learning a lot. And we will actually look at the cases of Russia, Turkey, Venezuela, and Ecuador in this session. I am the moderator and the speaker at the same time. Looks like a enhancement of executive power, but I will try not to abuse that. We thought for logistical reasons, it would be the best because this is the last session. Our speakers are Valerie Sperling and Orçun Selçuk. Valerie Sperling is a professor of political science at Clark University. And among others, she's the author of this amazing book on sex, politics, and Putin, Political Legitimacy in Russia, Oxford University Press. Because you have the bios, so we're not getting into them. And Orçun Selçuk, is at Luther College, Iowa. He is one of those scholars that I know who does truly comparative work, and I benefit a lot actually from his work. He worked on, polarizing populism in Venezuela, Ecuador, and Turkey. So it's a pleasure to have you here. And without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor to Valerie.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen, try to show you my PowerPoint. There we go. Can you see that? Okay, great. So in this setting, I'm going to assume that I don't need to say much about the history of the Russian political system. I'm just going to point out that today's Russian regime is not a mobilizational dictatorship like the Soviet Union was under the Communist Party with the parades and the party meetings and constant public rituals where the population was expected to support the state. Today's Russia, in good electoral authoritarian fashion, allows elections without genuine competition, uses legal technicalities and sometimes violence to keep its opponents off the ballot, and keeps a fairly tight grip on freedom of information and civil society, using restrictive laws and police violence to limit the frequency and range of public protest. And it does these things despite the fact that the president is extremely popular. In short, this is a regime that aims to keep the political field narrow in order to maintain its perceived legitimacy and power. So I want to take a very quick look at some of the authoritarian practices being used in Russia to maintain that narrow public sphere. First, there have been persistent efforts to prevent oppositionists from gaining political traction, which has at times produced some pretty significant social protests, like what happened after the elections in December 2011 to the parliament, where there was blatant ballot stuffing electoral fraud. And that benefited the United Russia Party, the regime's party. This was followed by new laws establishing exorbitant fines for protesting without a permit, and legislation intended to prevent offense to religious believers in order to avert more challenges to Putin, like what Pussy Riot, the feminist punk collective, had created in the spring of 2012 with their viral video of their punk prayer, which called on the Virgin Mary to remove Putin from office. The regime has also made it essentially impossible for anyone to mount a presidential campaign to challenge Putin. In 2018, Alexei Navalny, who Tim mentioned before, an anti-corruption activist who wanted to run for president, was not allowed on the ballot. And in 2015, another Putin rival, Boris Nemtsov, was shot to death in central Moscow. And even the party of Ksenia Sobchak, the first woman to run for president in Russia, who got less than 2% of the vote in 2018, her Civic Initiative Party was recently banned under orders from the Russian Supreme Court. So this is another selective use of the legal system to keep the political sphere narrow. What's interesting is that the regime makes a concerted effort to limit the liberal opposition from gaining a toehold, even at the local level, where one could argue that it may not matter very much. This issue came to a head last summer in Moscow because several liberal oppositionists had collected signatures to register their candidacies and get on the ballot for the Moscow City Council for this election that was held in September of last year. But when they did this, the Electoral Commission claimed that the candidates didn't have enough signatures or that the signatures were faked. And so people who had helped collect those signatures for these candidates began putting out the word that the government was cheating the people of their right to vote by keeping legitimate candidates off the ballot. So this resulted in protests of increasing size throughout the summer, with people demanding, give Moscow back our elections. And despite the fact that some of the protests were held with the government's permission, hundreds of protesters and bystanders were beaten up by police, and about 2,500 people were arrested over the course of the summer. And a number of them were charged with really serious crimes like mass rioting and injuring police officers, crimes that carried really significant jail terms as a way to deter further protests. Now, there are some forms of protest that activists take advantage of, such as the single picket, which is legal. And here you can see a protester in Moscow early last summer supporting Ivan Golunov, a journalist who was arrested after he had been writing about corruption in Russia's funeral industry, and also had reported on the deputy mayor of Moscow, whose salary didn't seem to be high enough to be able to afford the luxurious penthouse apartments that he appeared to own. So Golunov's apartment was searched, and the police, quote unquote, found the illegal drugs that they had planted there, and they charged him with felony drug possession. After 4 days of continuous protests outside of Moscow's police headquarters, they dropped the false charges and released him. The regime also uses the law to restrict criticism of Putin on the internet. This past summer, a new law established a large fine for insulting public figures on the web, but this has only been used to fine people who have insulted President Putin specifically, referring to him as a thief or a retard or a condom, which is an insult in Russian. Other legalized forms of repression include laws aimed at restricting civic organizing, such as Russia's foreign agent law in 2012, according to which any group that the government thinks conducts political activity and gets foreign funding is labeled as a foreign agent. So if an environmental group gets a foreign grant or a donation even from a foreigner, the group can be labeled as a foreign agent, which is intended to, render that group a pariah. So Putin's political opposition is kept to a minimum by the regime by using various forms of coercion, both of the legalistic variety and also just the direct use of force. But Putin is also very popular. As you know, his approval ratings are close to 70% positive. And there are a number of reasons for this, including that from early on, he was presented to the public as this tough, assertive, macho leader who was going to put Russia back on the world stage, which he has done. And in that light, I would briefly note that I think gender constitutes an important element of political legitimacy in these electoral authoritarian systems, that a certain kind of machismo goes a long way toward almost insulating a president from backlash and maintaining his popularity and authority. So for people who are just living their daily lives, this kind of authoritarian regime might appear to be largely benign. But when people attempt to get involved in the political sphere beyond voting, that's when you see the state's attacks on opposition politicians, or handing out fines and arrests and beatings for protesting. And the media either censors that information or portrays the protesters in an anti-patriotic light as agents of foreign powers who are out to undermine Russia. So this makes for an insidious authoritarianism, where financial corruption deprives the population of the medical and social welfare and other services that they're owed by law, because those funds are disappearing into the pockets of politicians and their business partner. But in a regime where the state presents this benign face, corruption does not come across as a political issue that requires democratization. Addressing problems like corruption is thought to require only a strong leader who provides stability and offers a firm hand to sort things out. And that obviously reinforces the existing system and the enormous personalist power that's concentrated in the president. So I'll just stop there. Thank you very much.
I will go ahead, and underline 4 significant characteristics of these regimes that we're talking about, call them new authoritarian regimes, while keeping an eye on the Turkish case. These are, first, competitive elections that are not free and fair and are on an uneven field, and all the legal changes that make this possible. I will try to refer to those. Secondly, a polarized language of politics that turns opponents into enemies. Thirdly, efforts by the incumbent governments to create a civil society that is loyal to the government, hence an effort to be the government and opposition at the same time. And fourthly, measures that are taken and that enhance the powers of the executive branch of government. Now, the elections, first of all, I start with that. The elections in these regimes, not free and fair, and they are competitive. And as we know, political activity is on an uneven field, with incumbents' use of media, resources, and the law for their own benefit, and hence challenging Adam Zaworski's well-known definition of democracy as a system in which parties lose elections. In most cases, incumbent governments do not lose national elections, yet they can still lose elections at times, at a local level. Istanbul elections for the mayor in 2019 was a case in point, with the candidate of the opposition political party becoming triumphant, and the fact that the opposition formed a coalition with former rivals was quite instrumental in that triumph, not to mention, of course, the amazing work by citizens who simply guarded their votes. They not only voted, but guarded their votes, by basically, sleeping by the booths until the votes were counted. So a similar victory for the opposition was actually realized in other major cities in Turkey. An uneven field is created by incumbent governments through legal measures, such as law amending ordinances. These legal changes do not always make headlines in the news. Rather, they usually go unnoticed, since they are buried in omnibus packaged laws or amendments to existing laws. Law amending ordinances in Turkey were used in the curtailment of academic freedoms. They are notoriously called with the acronym KHK, KHK, with their initials. And there is an expression actually in the most recent blog that Kim Scheppele shared with us. This piece on Orban's emergency. Kim says, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban never lets a crisis go to waste. And I believe this is a future of all incumbent leaders in new authoritarian regimes. Turkey's President Erdogan, for instance, called the 2016 coup attempt a godsend and did not waste the state of emergency declared after the coup attempt. Over 1,000 law amending ordinances were declared during this time, leading to amendments over 1,000 laws in several aspects of governance. One such amendment, just to portray how it is done, interestingly illustrates, how the changes are undertaken. A critical change in legislation concerning the lifting of the responsibility of the High Electoral Council to ensure the equal representation of the competing candidates' arguments, in private radio and television channels before elections, referendums. This was buried in a packaged law. It was a change to, the responsibility of the High Electoral Council, and it was buried in a packaged law. This package, you go and look into it. This package highlighted the new amendments about the utilization of snow tires, a relatively insignificant issue, and the related fines by devoting several lines to their explanation, while the lifting of the responsibility of the High Electoral Council, which is a highly significant responsibility, it was hardly visible. It was only mentioned as, Article number 9, in 2 lines, that an article in the laws governing elections was removed. So you had to really go out of your way to learn about this change to the existing laws. So secondly, the leaders of incumbent governments use, as I said, a polarized language towards opposition political parties. In Turkey, the main opposition party was even accused of being a subcontractor for the July 15, 2016 coup attempt. The co-leader of the pro-Kurdish opposition political party has been in prison for over 3 years on terrorism charges. The opposition is portrayed not as rivals, but rather enemies. Sometimes, I cannot help but remember Chantal Mouffe's, arguments back in the 1990s when she explained the return of conflict, to the political arena, since the efforts to manage conflict and promote compromise seems to have led to an unbearable lightness of being a boredom that seems to invite conflictual language by the electorate. I must add that some recent developments, such as efforts on the part of the government to monitor the news about the coronavirus in Turkey, Turkey's Ministry of Internal Affairs, or rather the Homeland Security, announced a few days ago that they have detected close to 3,000 social media accounts spreading false news about the virus and are taking legal measures against them. There's already arrests. These people were called terrorists with foreign links, and there has been, arrests. In fact, the ministry complained that they're unable to act as swiftly as they like against them due to an earlier decision taken by the Constitutional Court. So, he complains about that decision. So accordingly, state security forces actually cannot take direct action, but have to go to the court before taking action. There is also a plan this week to release about 70,000 inmates in order to prevent the spread of the coronavirus in penitentiaries. Nevertheless, this does not include civil society activists and journalists who are awaiting trials or serving sentences on the basis of the anti-terror law. Thirdly, so, they are opposition as the enemy. Thirdly, new authoritarian regimes create and foster their own civil society organizations while portraying prior civil activism as unpatriotic and engaging in a crackdown against them. The incumbent political party in Turkey, Justice and Development Party, was specifically active in the formation of pro-family women's civil society organizations, formed this Turkish family platform with over 90 civil society organizations in an attempt to promote family values. So while on the one hand co-opting civil society, many veteran civil activists are facing arrests and detentions. Fourthly, neo-authoritarian regimes take consistent measures geared towards enhancing the powers of the executive branch of government. In Turkey, these measures were specifically visible in the 2017 constitutional amendments passed in a national referendum in April 2017 under a state of emergency, defying all common sense notions of free and fair elections. These amendments led to a new presidential regime devoid of the basic checks and balances, replacing Turkey's long-established tradition of parliamentary regime. They led to a political regime designed to ensure that the incumbents uninterruptedly stay in power. Venice Commission was openly critical of the both timing and the content of these amendments and warned of the dangers of degeneration towards an authoritarian and personal regime. So the grab of power that took place in Hungary last week, in fact, has happened back in 2017. The 2017 constitutional amendments gave the president the right to issue executive decrees, now called presidential decrees, in matters related to executive power, in quotes, matters related to executive power, which is a very vaguely defined area. The president does not basically need empowering by the parliament for these decrees. He derives the power to issue them directly from the Constitution. An appalling article states that in case the Assembly decides to renew elections during the second term of the President of the Republic, he can be a candidate once more. For a president with a majority in Parliament, this may lead to third and more terms. Another unusual new practice is about the vice president. They are neither elected nor approved by the parliament. So in case of vacancy of the office of the president, an unelected official assumes all presidential powers until the next presidential election. So Kim was referring to the Constitutional Court earlier, with the realm of the courts increasing, widening, the number of the Constitutional Court judges increasing. It is really not so much of a matter of the number of the judges increasing in Turkey, but it has to do with, the High Council of Judges and Prosecutors who are influential, in the election of the members of the Constitutional Court. So that is how the independence of the judiciary, in fact, is influenced by the incumbent political party. These amendments, portray an enhancement of the power of the executive, which is now not shared between a president, a prime minister, and a cabinet, but represented solely by the president. So in conclusion, let me say that the constitution that was amended in Turkey already had several authoritarian features. So one should not get the idea that all was good until 2017. In fact, Turkuler Isıksel, who moderated our second session, calls this the tradition of authoritarian constitutionalism in Turkey. Hence, 2017 amendments are not the only culprits. They are rather the last nail on the coffin. Thank you. And Orçun, please go ahead.
All right. Thank you for the invitation. It's a really honor to be on the same panel and the same workshop with such a distinguished panel of scholars. I'm going to be sharing my PowerPoints as well. So you should be able to see it right now. So I'm going to be talking about another concept, which is, I would say, becoming very, very prominent in not only our daily discussions, but also academic discussions. And I'm also a little bit cautious of the use of populism and coronavirus, populism and autocratic legalism, but given the conference's, I would say, focus on autocratic legalism, I wanted to take a look at this concept from a populism perspective. So specifically, populism from the perspective of inclusionary versus exclusionary populism, because existing research in the populism literature has the tendency to categorize countries' cases of populism either as exclusionary populism or inclusionary populism, right? So I would say the prototypical cases of exclusionary populism are located in Europe. So cases in France, like Front National, and then in Netherlands, right? These far right populist figures who tend to be exclusionary towards immigrants, adopting these xenophobic attitudes. And I would categorize Orban probably under this category as well, given the literature's regional focus on European populism being exclusionary. On the other hand, the literature also, in contrast, I would say, categorizes Latin American populism as inclusionary populism, right? Inclusionary because it basically offers an inclusion to formerly marginalized people, right? So, and the typical examples of this, I would say, in the literature are Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, to a lesser extent, maybe Rafael Correa in Ecuador. I do disagree with this classification because I think all cases of populism, regardless of its geographical or ideological, I would say, label, they have to be, by definition, they have to be both inclusionary and exclusionary. They're inclusionary towards their in-group and exclusionary towards their out-group. So in that sense, even a case like Trump, I think, exemplifies both inclusionary and exclusionary populism, right? He's exclusionary towards his base. I would say a lot of people are empowered by Trump in the United States, right? Or a lot of people are empowered by the Bernie Sanders campaign, but at the same time, a lot of people feel excluded by both, populist leaders, even though one is from the left, the other is from the right. So in this conceptual framework, I would say autocratic legalism is an instrument of populism, either populist leaders, movements, or parties, right? To punish opponents while rewarding supporters, right? And I think that's an important element of autocratic legalism, which is inclusionary towards your supporters and followers, but exclusionary towards the others, right? The previous presentations, I think, did a fantastic job to identify, right, the enemies of the people, these people that you have to rally against, because these are not real Americans, these are not real Turkish, real Venezuelans, these are the enemies of our nation. So then I would say my argument here is that populist leaders, regardless of their ideological and geographical, I would say, label, they successfully use autocratic legal instruments to broaden their coalition and castigate the enemies of the people at the same time. So I'm just going to give 3 examples, very short, from Turkey, from Ecuador, and Venezuela, to demonstrate my argument. So in the Turkish case, we have this law called about insulting the Turkish president, which is the Article 299 of the Turkish Penal Code, which criminalizes insults of the Turkish president, even though the law has been in place since 1961, which is 1 year after the 1960 military coup in Turkey. There has been a dramatic increase of this law, this application of the law, and its visibility under Erdogan. So if you look at this chart, right, it looks like the coronavirus. There are a couple of cases initially, and then under Erdogan, there is a significant increase, right? And that's the number of prison sentences for insulting the president. Even though this law existed before Erdogan, right, it became more prominent, and it actually led to prison sentences increasingly, right? It's such a huge increase. I would say, given this law, even though this law existed, Erdogan used the existing laws, in his favor, to silence his critiques, to basically encourage self-censorship. So again, in the age of coronavirus, you can say, to flatten the curve, you have to do some social distancing, right? If you want to flatten this curve, then you might want to stay away from criticizing and insulting Erdogan, right? It's not something that we can just flatten by continuing to, engage our political freedoms. In Ecuador, another case that I've been looking at throughout my research, there is this organic law of communication which was passed or adopted under Correa, which established this media watchdog called Supercom, right? Which was, which encouraged, the Correa administration to go into conflict with major newspapers like El Universo in Ecuador. And then even like with cartoonists, which is, I think, also a prominent in the Turkish case, right? This conflict between cartoonists and these authoritarian populist leaders. For example, Bonil, who is Javier Bonilla, this famous Ecuadorian cartoonist, he faced fines. He wasn't imprisoned, so I would say Ecuador compared to Turkey and Venezuela is a little bit softer. But the media under Correa, through legal mechanisms, faced these fines and these tools to regulate. In other words, it was legal, but it was authoritarian or autocratic, which was done under Correa administration, which is interesting because Correa's successor Lenin Moreno, this law initially stayed. It was still there, but it was not implemented, and then it was abolished last year, which also shows that you might still have the law, but having the law doesn't mean it's going to be implemented in an autocratic way. Okay. And the third one, Turkey is, and I'm just going to go briefly over this because Javier Corrales has done a fantastic job to talk about the Venezuelan case. And it has to do with the constitution making process, right? Which, again, the contagious, mechanisms of, constitution making, which was started in, with Chavez, even when he was, becoming in inauguration ceremony, he said, this is a dying constitution. I'm swearing in, but this is just a dying constitution, right? And Evo Morales and Correa, he did the same thing. I think what is key in Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia is this: after the establishment of new elections, new constitution, all elections were renewed, right? You renewed the election not only for presidency, but also for the legislative, but also for municipal. That gave those leaders, to completely transform the political spectrum and have a fresh start. And in Turkey, they use the label New Turkey, right? And in Venezuela, they use, the Bolivarian revolution. In Ecuador, they use the citizen revolution. And in Bolivia, they use the change process. In López Obrador's Mexico, it's the fourth transformation. I think that's also important, that these leaders come up with new terms, as a fresh start to, break away from the past. The reason why I describe Venezuela as a plebiscitary democracy, which I would say Turkey under Erdogan and of Rafael Correa's, Ecuador's plebiscitary as well, is because of this use of referendums, right? Frequent referendums to change the law in their favor. And whenever they fail, they don't mind doing another referendum, which is also another mechanism of losing doesn't really matter. I lost, but it doesn't count. Let's do it one more time, which also happened in the recent Turkish elections, which happened in Bolivia under Evo Morales. Right, he lost the referendum, but he passed it anyway. I think which is also common among these regimes is, even though we talk about all these institutional legal changes, at the end of the day, in the referendums, it boils down to whether you support or oppose Chavez, whether you support or oppose Erdogan, because an average voter doesn't really read what's in the law. They're in favor or against Chavez, Erdogan, Morales, whoever you want to name. So conclusions, I think autocratic legalism and populism, they do interact as terms in the context of the unequal application of the law. Right, the law is there, but it's applied unequally to the follower versus the opponents of the populist leader. Right, so that's one thing, which leads to polarized perceptions of authoritarianism, which in the West, right, in the United States and in Western Europe, we tend to assume that these regimes are perceived as authoritarian by everyone. That's not the case. And in fact, Chavez supporters would argue that under Chavez, that was the real democracy. Right? They don't see it as authoritarian. They see it as the bottom-up participatory democracy with communal councils, the Bolivarian circle, right? In Turkey, it's the true democracy, right? That after the coup attempt, Turkey actually rescued this democracy to then move towards an authoritarian direction. And that's, I think, mainly not because these people are lying, not because these people are dishonest, is because they don't experience authoritarianism the same way as the opponents of these populist leaders experience. So that's why it's not surprising to me to see Erdogan supporters Chavez supporters, or even Maduro supporters, to tell us that where is the authoritarianism? I can say whatever I want. There is freedom of expression here. That's because they do experience it differently compared to a person who tweets on Erdogan and then ends up in prison. Thank you. I can't hear you.
Okay, yeah, now I did it. I unmuted. Okay, thank you very much, Orçun. So we have a little bit of time, for a discussion. I think, if you want, you can raise your hands under, the participation, I think. Let me start, because now I'm thinking about the entire, all the sessions, but I think earlier it was Valerie who brought it up, used the expression contagious, I mean, since we live in the era of virus, I mean, these are the terms that come to mind. And I do know, for instance, that in Venezuela, one of the key opposition leaders, Leopoldo López, was charged for disseminating subliminal messages. This was, I think, back in 2014, basically encouraging people to go out in the streets and, demonstrate against the government. Encouraging violence, basically, through subliminal messages. A similar charge, this happened actually, he was charged in 2015 for what he, did in 2014. A similar charge was used against, a journalist, for instance, in Turkey a year later, in 2015. I mean, these are like miles apart. So I thought, yes, it is contagious. But more like, these regimes learn from each other, I think. There's this element of deliberateness that is important to, I think, underline. So I have actually one question as the moderator, and then I see hands, so I'll go back to you. I would like to give Valerie, the chance to say a few things about how laws are used, against women and the LGBT, because I know this is a huge issue in Russia, and I know Valerie is very informed about it. I think I'm gonna also start collecting questions because we have very limited time. I will go to Dan Kelemen.
Here we go. All right, can you hear me now? Yeah. My question, I mean, it can be for, the last panelists in particular, really anyone else who wants to chime in. I guess this whole discussion has got me thinking about, when I've been working on issues related to autocratic legalism, on the one hand, we sometimes look at that, let's say, in the context of a situation like in Hungary, where, it seemed like the regime was trying to stay within the bounds of what it could claim was, legal within its own system and within EU law, et cetera. On the other hand, there's this whole phenomena in regimes, let's say like in Turkey, or even more authoritarian regimes like in China or Russia, where that there's the whole process called rule by law, right? That whole literature by Tom Ginsburg and others. And I guess my question is really, do we need to think about a distinction between autocratic legalism, which is something that really is a limit on how far a hybrid regime will go to stay within the limits of law? And is that different from just rule by law in even the most blatantly, dictatorial regimes where, they're always going to claim that it's sort of legal what they're doing? It seems to me that there's two different types and maybe different phenomena we're talking about.
Let me also ask Senem Aydın Düzgit to pose her question, and then we'll turn to the panelists.
Yeah, thank you. No, I had a similar, well, actually my question is more about the limits to this, because one thing that really puzzled me, and that still puzzles me about the Turkish case, is the way in which Erdogan conceded defeat, right? And conceded in Istanbul, Ankara, all of the major cities. And many people were arguing at the time that that just wasn't possible. So why was it possible? I mean, obviously he could have gone, you know, I don't know, through different means to make sure that he still kept power, like legally as well, maybe he could have, but he didn't. So I find it conceptually quite hard to sort of to explain that. I mean, is it because of legitimacy constraints, or what was it that really made him concede? And I think that's worth thinking about when we try to think about the limits of autocratic legalism, or rule by autocratic legalism.
I actually also see Javier Corrales' hand right now, so let's also get Javier's question too.
Thank you. I really like Orchun's idea of connecting autocratic legalism with populism, stated that way. In Latin America, this is perhaps more of a comment, to Senem and then back to Orchun, they face hurdles all the time, and many times they do concede defeat. So that's not that remarkable. That doesn't surprise me. It's just that they just figure out a way to recoup. The other thing I want to say is, one of the things that makes these politics so appealing is all these regimes produce what David Collier from Berkeley University used to describe inducements and constraints. This combination, carrots and sticks. And we haven't talked a lot about the carrots. And in Latin America, populist autocrats have relied significantly on heavy spending. That's a problem because they run out of money. But one of the amazing things that I think our European counterparts have discovered is that they can produce inducements that are less tangible, and therefore they don't run out. They don't run out of those inducements. It could be just a discourse, a cultural battle of sorts, and in that sense, they're less prone to being undermined. In Latin America at the moment, Juan Domingo Perón in the 1950s ran out of money. That was the end of him. This happens to all these folks who use money as an inducement. Can we talk a little bit more about the inducements, the sweeteners, the sugar coating that is taking place in these cases in Turkey, Hungary, Russia, and Poland?
Thank you, Javier. And one more comment from Elżbieta, and then we'll go back to the panelists.
I don't know. It's a partial response to the question that was just raised. I think it is very important to see what works and how are those inducements actually translate into the support for the autocratic legalism. In the case of Poland, it was rather extraordinary that one of the first things they did almost immediately after they took power was to issue a provision for families who had more than 2 children, so-called 500 plus, to receive monthly $500 per child. Each child, which is more than, so in other words, 3rd child, 4th child, and so on. It changed so dramatically the way impoverished part of the population began to look at that government. 500 zlotys, it's a lot of money. You can say it's 1/3 of a very modest salary, but it's 1/3 of the very modest salary. If you have 2 children, that then you are get 1,000. I'm talking about it because it was really to pit very clearly, to be part of the population that was neglected and that was not thought about by the previous centrist, liberal, enlightened regime, that people had to be helped. That was out of the equation. I think this was an incredibly important move. Many women stopped working because they could afford actually being at home with their children. That made a huge difference. That's one thing I wanted to say in direct response to that. I also wanted to say about the other part of the question, which is the constraints or the punishment aimed at the elites, the intellectuals, the political dissidents, and it is not. Sometimes it is directly aimed at them. Wojciech Sadurski, who is a well-known Polish lawyer, teaches in Australia right now, actually at NYU, had been taken to court by the Polish government for directly by the Law and Justice Party for saying inappropriate things about them, criticizing them. And this is happening more and more. Individuals are being targeted by law. A colleague who is going to arrive in the fall here to New York as a new university in exile scholar. Up to now, we had mostly people from Turkey. Now we actually are beginning to have people from the other parts of the world. Well, it is because he criticized his university for giving a special award to a regional official who was who spoke to exercise a hate speech against LGBT people, women, and migrants from Ukraine. And I'm just talking individual targets, and very quickly the larger public, and this is something. The attacks were open against, and it is not necessarily visible, against the whole new layer of museums. So it's a fight about memory, about the public memory and social memory, which had to do with the fairly recent present, the present of the Second World War. So 3 museums had been closed. There was a crisis concerning, which is partially solved right now, the Museum of Polish Jews. So I'm talking about that. And then, so institutions, cultural institutions, which actually talk about which actually represent the way of thinking in terms of pluralism, of tolerance, and so on and so on. And then there is a new layer of attacks against universities. I'm going to finish right now, but I think it's important to know that those are not always legal things, but they are things done by power and with the support, very frequently the support of the people who thought that the prior power was, as was already discussed last time, had a dirty hands because of its unproven charges of corruption. Thank you.
Dan, is that I see a hand, you Dan Kelemen?
Yeah, but if we need to go straight back to the panelists, I can just lower it.
If he could be brief, then we will conclude with the panelists. Go ahead.
Literally one sentence. Just the question came up about the role of funding in these regimes, and I would just reiterate what I said. In the EU context, it's central, right? Orban gets more money per capita than any member state from the EU. Poland gets more money overall than any state. And particularly for the Orban regime, the distribution of those funds is crucial to how he holds power.
Okay.
I can jump in maybe to some questions. So I can answer the question regarding concession of defeat. So again, in Latin America, Maduro conceded, when he lost against the opposition in 2015, but then he basically stripped, the opposition's control of the National Assembly, right? Evo Morales, he conceded, right, the referendum, but then later on he passed it anyway through the courts. And I think the emphasis on courts is also important if we're going to discuss autocratic legalism. In Turkey, I think the margin of victory is, I think, important here. If the margin of victory is close, I think they're more resistant. In Turkey, initially through the Electoral Council, they resisted, and then in the repeat, the margin was higher. But even in the late coronavirus fundraising events, the executive branch is trying to curb the influence of mayors in Turkey, in Istanbul and Ankara, in order to raise funds, for the coronavirus relief package, I would say, at the local level. I think that's one thing. As long as they can curb the influence of the National Assembly, as long as they can curb the influence of local officials, I think they're more willing to concede. I think it would still be a challenge. I wouldn't put my money on Erdogan losing an election in the upcoming and then conceding that election. I think for him to concede the election, it has to be a significant margin. I think another variable, going back to Javier Corrales' presentation, is the asymmetrical party fragmentation. I think in recent years, the opposition in Turkey has become more competitive. And I think that's the case in Bolivia as well, right? That all of these leaders benefited from fragmented opposition. And while opposition could overcome their ideological differences and organize efficiently, I think it opened some democratic perspective, not only with mood in Venezuela, in Turkey, even though the opposition parties come from a variety of ideological backgrounds, they could unite in the name of fighting Erdogan, even at the local level. So I think concession is definitely something, because going back to Schwarzkopf's definition, right? If you lose elections, that's what democracy, you will figure out whether it's actually a democracy. I think that's a legitimate question. For Javier Corrales' question on inducement and I think constraints, I think besides the material, and definitely in the Turkish case, there was no oil rent, which is a good thing, right? For the Turkish case overall. I think it's undeniable to say that under the first, I would say, 2-3 AKP governments, Turkey has achieved significant economic growth, right, under AKP, which, even though it's a right-wing authoritarian regime or populist government, it also used clientelism, through conditional cash transfers. Maybe Erdogan did not have his misiones, right? But Erdogan definitely has strong support among lower segments, lower socioeconomic status, right, in Turkey. I think a good comparison from Latin America is, Fujimori's use of, these social programs to, capitalize on his popularity. So I think it's a mistake. It would be a mistake to assume that only left-wing populists are redistributing, They may not be redistributing oil, but they may be redistributing, to their constituencies through these cash transfers, through other social programs, which is actually one of the reasons why many AKP supporters continue to vote for AKP, because they fear that if the opposition comes, that money will be gone, right? And the opposition in Turkey is lately trying to assure that even if the opposition comes, you're not going to lose that flow of income, right? I think regardless of being left and right, these are smart leaders that they know to be popular, they have to deliver, right, materially and symbolically, right? And I think Erdogan's case, he uses religion for that purpose, right? His strategic use of religion is very important, I think, to understand his popularity as well.
Thank you, Roshan. Valerie, go ahead.
Thank you. So yeah, on this question of how are laws used selectively against, women activists and LGBT, I think everybody probably knows about the homosexual propaganda law, which has been wielded in Russia against the LGBT community. It's interesting in terms of feminist activism and how laws get used selectively there. As some of you probably know, domestic violence was decriminalized. Sort of domestic battery was decriminalized a couple of years ago. And one of the organizations that's spoken out most around issues of domestic violence, it's this network of crisis centers called ANA, they got labeled as a foreign agent right around that same time. And so you just sort of wonder if the regime kind of strategically selects groups to label as a foreign agent. Also, the single picket that I mentioned, this, where it's legal to just stand, with your little sign X feet away from the next person with their little sign. One really strong advocate against domestic violence named Alyona Popova was actually protesting in front of the Russian parliament, the Duma. She was protesting against sexual harassment that had been committed by this one Duma deputy, Leonid Slutsky. And she was actually protesting with a cardboard cutout of Leonid Slutsky next to her in a single picket, and she was arrested, and the police argued that it was not a single picket because she was there with her cardboard cutout of Leonid Slutsky. So, so the law can be, can be wielded, as seen as necessary by the people in power. To Javier's question about the inducements and stuff, I think it's interesting to think about the context, like what happened right before these leaders got into power? Like what was the political and social and economic context right before they came into power? In the Russian case, man, like any inducement that you could have brought with you would have been welcomed, so the first 10 years of inducements were economic, because lucky Putin, the price of oil was going up for 10 years, and then beyond that, I guess I would say the population had been so deprived of pride over the course of the 90s. The superpower disappears. The economic, everybody's economic wherewithal, except for, this one small stratum of people, disappears. And so, what could Putin bring to bear? After the financial benefits, I guess there's also these less tangible, as you say, inducements, like putting Russia back on, the international agenda, like taking Crimea, like bringing Russia up off its knees and giving people a reason to be proud of their state. Now, obviously, it doesn't work for everybody. There's the liberal people or more democratically inclined people are kind of appalled by some of what Putin was has been doing. But anyway, I do think it's interesting to think about the context in which these authoritarian leaders come to power. And I guess maybe in some ways the worse things are before they come to power, the better off they are, because they can offer a whole range of inducements that make people go into their camp and stay there.
Okay, thank you, Valerie. I think we have reached the end. I can see your wonderful messages, I just want to say this basically. Thank you, Javier, for insisting to your editor to keep the title Autocratic Legalism, because it is very helpful, as it turns out, for all of us, in fact. It is really a tool, really, to look at these regimes and understand them in a better way. What is happening is, I think, at the end of the day, politics is more and more is being reduced to a legal fight, basically, because this has been happening in Turkey a lot, actually, because opposition was taking every decision to the constitutional court. So the politics has been reduced to a tug of war over these legal issues, whereas we have embraced this idea of public deliberation all this time, and we seem to be losing that to a great extent. I mean, these political leaders are not really talking to each other, but taking, decisions to the constitutional court. So, and constitutional courts, in fact, have become really essential for the survival of politics in a strange way. So on that note, I think, you know, it's probably time to say goodbye. Although I hate to say goodbye, I'm really enjoying this. I mean, this is amazing. You know, as I said at the beginning, when you do this on an online format, there certain advantages come with it. I can see my, you know, former PhD student who's now a postdoc in Sweden. It's, you know, just amazing to see all of you from various parts of the world. Thank you for being here, Bengi. And I want to end. I have become a big admirer, of, actually, maybe because I've been away from home for a while now, of Bertolt Brecht's poetry. And I want to refer to the lines, you know, when he says, in the dark times, he says, will there also be singing? Yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. So it seems we have been singing about the dark times in this workshop. The fact that we can still sing, you know, as a metaphor for talking and exchanging ideas, is actually the key that will lighten up our journey towards better times. So I hope to see you in better times. We really wanted to host you here at Columbia. So I'm very grateful that you know, you were eager to take part in this online workshop. So thank you very much. So I put my you know, thing here. How do you do that? I'm giving you know, here it is. Okay. Thank you.